The janitor's kid dares to touch my $100 million problem? Victor Hale spat straight into Caleb's face in the middle of the company lobby, his mocking laugh cutting like a blade. Evelyn Brooks gripped her mop tightly, while the boy calmly stepped forward, marker in hand, tearing through arrogance with a few strokes of formulas that made the entire room hold its breath. CEO Richard Cole turned pale, forced to admit before hundreds of eyes, this boy just saved the company. In that moment, the truth hit the abuser like a slap to the face. Genius can rise from tattered shoes, and intellect will always crush contempt. In the morning, sunlight poured over the marble steps of the towering financial building, where polished glass reflected pure luxury. Evelyn Brooks hunched over, pushing a heavy cleaning cart, its wheels squeaking every time they caught a groove in the tile. Beside her, her son Caleb walked quietly, one small hand resting on the edge of the cart as if to share some of the burden with his mother. His face held a spark of curiosity, dark eyes scanning the gleaming brass plaques bearing the names of the conglomerate's subsidiaries. To Evelyn, these glass walls were just a place to earn a living, but to Caleb, they were mazes filled with numbers begging to be solved. As the two stepped into the main lobby, a security guard emerged, his half-smile laced with disdain. He raised a hand to block them, his voice loud enough for the reception desk to hear. This is $1 billion headquarters, not a daycare. Soft snickers echoed around them. A few glances flicked down to Evelyn's faded uniform before quickly turning away. Evelyn swallowed hard, her narrow shoulders slumping. She was used to being dismissed, but this time, that raised hand hurt more because Caleb was standing right there. She gently pulled him behind her, trying to hide the pain in her eyes, but Caleb took a step forward instead, lifting his head to stare at the massive screen hanging in the center of the lobby. On it, numbers flashed rapidly, red filling the graphs. It was the language of crisis, of failure, of hundreds of millions of dollars slipping away from the corporation. Caleb stared at it for a long moment, then spoke a sentence that sounded almost casual. Those numbers, they're all wrong. His tone was calm, not loud, but clear enough to travel. The reception area fell silent for a beat, then erupted in sneering laughter. The guard folded his arms and howled. You hear that? The janitor's kid is giving us lessons. Someone else mocked. Guess he thinks he's in kindergarten, sees a bunch of red shapes, and thinks he's an expert. Evelyn's face flushed red. She reached to pull Caleb away, but he didn't move, eyes still locked on the screen. In his mind, those numbers were no longer a mystery. They were scrambled because the formulas were flawed. He could see the gap clearly, like a wide-open door no one dared to walk through. But to everyone else, he was just a skinny kid in worn-out shoes, bold enough to comment on a multi-billion-dollar crisis. A group of young employees passed by. Hearing Caleb's words, they burst into laughter. One of them sneered, "Your mom scrubs floors here and probably won't keep that job for long, but you're standing there lecturing the company?" Their laughter mixed with the sharp clack of dress shoes across the marble, echoing through the wide lobby. Evelyn turned to her son, ready to say something to silence him, but in Caleb's eyes, there was no fear, only intense focus. A woman in a sleek business dress stopped, raising an eyebrow at Caleb like he was some kind of joke. Her voice was tight. Every kid loves to dream, but don't forget, this is where markets are made and broken. We don't need child actors. The group roared with laughter again, loud and cutting, like the old broom Evelyn pushed every day. Cheap, invisible, and easy to kick aside. Caleb took a deep breath, his eyes quietly scanning the data boards once more. He knew he had just opened the first door in a chain of brutal collisions. He hadn't responded to anyone, but that silence only poured fuel on the fire of ridicule. A young employee jerked his chin and raised his voice. What? No comeback? Or has the kid realized he's just dumb? Whistles echoed, turning the financial lobby into a ruthless stage. Evelyn tightened her grip on her son's hand and whispered, "Let's go, Caleb, don't make trouble." But Caleb didn't move, his gaze locked on the glaring error on the screen, a fire rising inside him that his mother had never seen before. For a brief moment, the grand lobby split in two. On one side, pride, laughter, and power. On the other, the figure of a mother and son beside an old cleaning cart, and a boy bold enough to speak defiance into the heart of a financial empire. In that moment, no one imagined that the words "they're all wrong" would become the seed of a quake that would one day bring the company to its knees. The laughter in the lobby hadn't even faded when three sharply dressed young employees stepped forward, blocking the path of Evelyn and Caleb. Their ties were tight, their expressions drawn with the confidence of men who believed they stood at the top. One of them swung his arm and threw a dirty, soaked rag straight at Caleb, his voice cutting through the hallway. "If you've got time, get on your knees and scrub the floor just like your mom's supposed to." The rag landed right at Caleb's feet, leaving a wet smear across the polished marble, a deliberate stain meant to remind him that he didn't belong here. Evelyn froze, her hand stiff on the handle of the cleaning cart, her heart clenching at the sight. Another one in the back let out a loud laugh, voice dripping with mockery. Heard you're some kind of genius? Guess that'll come in handy when you're scrubbing toilets. More laughter erupted, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling, turning every head in the lobby toward Evelyn and her son like they were the stars of a cheap comedy act. Evelyn bent down to pick up the rag, but Caleb placed his hand over hers, his eyes still burning bright, completely unmoved. Caleb lifted his head and spoke slowly, each word deliberate. Toilets need to be clean, just like formulas need to be correct. The sentence, plain on the surface, hit like a blade in that polished lobby, cutting through arrogance. A few people nearby flinched, caught off guard, their faces reddening with bruised pride. An awkward silence spread, heavy and sharp, blanketing the space that just moments ago buzzed with noise. A second later, the laughter burst back even louder, as if to drown out their discomfort. A woman clapped mockingly. Did you hear that? The kid's teaching the company math now. Someone else chimed in. Probably thinks he'll be CEO one day, and he's not even old enough for college. The laughter swelled again, harsh and bitter, laced with both contempt and a hint of invisible fear. Evelyn tried to pull Caleb away from the circle, but his hand stayed firmly on hers, his eyes locked with a determination that said he had no intention of backing down. Within the crowd, not every face was laughing. One young employee glanced at Caleb and furrowed his brow, as if struck by a flicker of curiosity and unease, but he quickly lowered his gaze, afraid to become a target by showing anything different. The crowd kept laughing, kept mocking, because in this place, standing with a janitor's child meant stepping outside the safety line. Victor Hale, the lobby floor manager, heard the noise and stepped out. The sound of his leather shoes on the hard floor instantly silenced the room. He looked Caleb up and down, his lips curling into a cold smile. No one here needs commentary from a janitor's kid. He bent down, picked up the cleaning rag, and tossed it back at Evelyn. His voice sliced through the air. Your job is to clean this place, not let your son put on a show. Evelyn gripped the broom handle tightly, her eyes shining as she struggled to keep the tears from falling. Caleb kept standing tall, his gaze unflinching. He knew every word of mockery, every contemptuous look was trying to crush him, but inside, a different kind of will had awakened. He repeated the numbers from the large screen in his mind, the errors as clear as tears in a sheet of fabric, and he understood that he couldn't stay silent. Even if he was just the son of a janitor, he had the right to speak when the truth was being twisted. Victor turned away, but before he could take another step, Caleb spoke loudly and clearly. If a formula is wrong, it must be fixed, just like a dirty floor must be cleaned. You can laugh at me, but the numbers won't laugh with you. The words landed like a stone thrown into a noisy lake. No one expected a child to hit back so sharply, using their own language to strike. A dead silence swept across the lobby. Every laugh was cut short, and this time, the quiet was truly unsettling. People stared at Caleb, no longer seeing just a kid in worn clothes, but a defiant gaze bold enough to tear through the wall of class. Evelyn felt her son's hand trembling in hers, but it wasn't fear, it was the heat of conviction. Laughter returned, louder and more forceful, but there was a strain beneath it. They needed to laugh to convince themselves that power still belonged to them, that a janitor's child couldn't possibly rattle the system. But Caleb had planted something uncomfortable in them, a quiet unease they hadn't yet recognized. Evelyn bent down and silently picked up the soaked rag, but her eyes flicked toward her son, and for the first time, she saw in him a fire that couldn't be put out. In a lobby filled with scornful laughter, the image of the boy standing tall, eyes still locked forward, had already made the first crack in the company's wall of arrogance. No one knew that from that very crack, an earthquake was waiting to erupt. The mocking laughter was still echoing through the lobby when Victor Hale, the floor manager, appeared from the elevator with an air of authority. The sound of his leather shoes hitting the marble made the atmosphere fall abruptly silent. He was tall, his face hard as stone, eyes scanning the room before locking onto Caleb. A twisted smile crept onto Victor's lips as he growled, his voice cold as steel. This kid says we calculated wrong? His words rang out like a hammer strike, instantly drawing all attention to the boy. In a split second, Victor had turned a child's casual comment into a charge, and Caleb into the accused, standing trial before the entire lobby. The employees around them quickly joined in, their whispers turning into shouts of delight. A man near the glass wall crossed his arms and yelled for everyone to hear. Yeah, let him try. If he's wrong, he and his mom get out of here. The crowd roared in agreement, clapping and whistling like they were shoving Caleb toward an invisible gallows. They didn't care whether he was right or wrong. What they wanted was a public humiliation to protect their own pride. Evelyn was so stunned she couldn't speak at first. Her face went pale, her hands still clinging to the handle of the cleaning cart like it was the only thing keeping her afloat in a violent sea. Her voice shook as she finally burst out, "You're being cruel." In her words was the panic and pain of a mother who had only ever wanted her son to walk quietly by her side, now torn open by the cruelty of a heartless crowd. But her protest was quickly drowned by mocking laughter, hushed whispers, and scornful glances. In that moment, Caleb stepped forward, his eyes shining as bright as any light in the lobby. He didn't turn to his mother for protection, nor did he back down in fear. His voice rang out, each word clear like a vow. "What if I'm right? Would you even admit it?" The air seemed to explode. A janitor's son, just a boy, standing before Victor Hale and dozens of corporate employees, had thrown out a challenge like a blade to the throat. The lobby shook. Laughter died suddenly, strangled by the weight of his words. An uneasy hush spread. Then the muttering resumed tenser, meaner. One employee shouted, "Did you hear that? He's challenging the whole company." Another scoffed. "Who does this kid think he is? Some kind of savior?" Their voices blended together, but beneath them lay a flicker of doubt. Because even as they mocked, they all knew if that challenge was real, it would make them all look like fools. Victor stepped forward, towering over Caleb, eyes burning with hatred. He leaned in and growled through gritted teeth. "What did you just say? You're challenging this entire corporation?" Caleb didn't blink. He looked up and answered, his voice firm. "Numbers don't care who speaks. They only care what's right or wrong. If I can prove it, will you dare admit you were wrong in front of everyone?" The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't just laughter. Some voices objected, others agreed, and a few worried glances flickered before being quickly hidden. People who had long lived safely within the comfort of power were now being forced to pick a side, and a child daring to ask a public question had shattered the order they once believed unshakable. Evelyn stood frozen, her heart tightening with fear that her son would bear the consequences. She wanted to pull Caleb away, to shield him from the cruelty of their words, but her hands trembled, unable to stop his forward steps. In her eyes was worry, but also a flicker of something new. She had never seen Caleb this strong, never seen her small boy stand tall like a grown man facing down a pack of wolves. Victor let out a loud, dry laugh, filled with scorn. "I want to see how far this circus goes. A ragged little brat with no real education dares to bark in this building. Fine, here's your chance. But remember this, if you're wrong, you and your mother will never set foot in here again. Consider yourselves disgraced for life." His laughter triggered a wave of cheers from the employees around him, whistling and shouting like they were gathering for a public execution. Caleb stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, pausing on the faces twisted in mockery, yet hungry for a show. He understood that there was no turning back, because to turn back meant letting his mother stay crushed under the weight of power. He took a deep breath, letting silence become his shield, then answered simply, "I accept." A collective gasp swept through the lobby. People standing near the glass walls stared at one another, stunned that the boy had agreed to walk into such a vicious trap. Evelyn froze, clutching her son's arm, shaking her head again and again, whispering in desperation, "Caleb, don't do this. They just want to humiliate you." But Caleb looked at his mother with calm eyes, then turned back to Victor. "Will you keep your word?" Victor clenched his jaw, the wicked grin never leaving his face. "What do you want, kid? You want to make a speech? Or grab a piece of chalk like you're in elementary school?" Caleb answered, "Just a whiteboard and a marker. The numbers will speak for me." For a brief moment, silence covered the room. The laughter and whispering stopped. Because this was no longer a joke, it had become a real confrontation. A child facing off against a corporation, and somehow, the child was the one setting the rules. In Victor's eyes, a flicker of anger sparked, but beneath it was a flash of hesitation he couldn't hide. Evelyn lowered her head, tears streaming down her face. But she no longer cried out. She knew Caleb had chosen his path, and all she could do was stand beside him, no matter how dangerous that path might be. She couldn't turn away, not when her son had found the courage to stand against an entire system. The air in the grand lobby felt compressed, every gaze locked onto the small boy standing before Victor Hale. On one side stood power, mockery, and threats. On the other hand, a clear but unyielding stare, a voice steady yet unwavering. The challenge had been made, and no one could pretend they hadn't heard it. In that moment, Caleb was no longer just the janitor's son. He had become the one who planted the seed of defiance, who dared to face contempt head-on, who pierced the wall of arrogance the entire corporation had built. And from this point on, his path had no way back. The air in the lobby had tightened into a heavy mass, every eye locked on Caleb like spotlights cast on an unwilling stage. A staff member quickly rolled a whiteboard out from a nearby meeting room, dropping it in front of the boy, then tossed him a marker. Caleb's hand trembled slightly as he took it, not out of fear, but because he knew that a single mistake could cost his mother her job and the last shred of dignity still flickering in her wounded eyes. He drew a deep breath, stared straight at the board, and his eyes lit with a focus far beyond his young years. Victor Hale stood with arms crossed, looming in front. The corners of his mouth curled into a malicious grin. He made sure to raise his voice so everyone could hear, his words echoing through the space. "Free entertainment, everyone. Stick around if you want to laugh. His remark triggered a wave of chuckles, phones raised high, flashes flickering. A young employee didn't miss the chance, starting a live stream instantly and gleefully titling it, "Janitor's Kid vs. Wall Street." Dozens of others joined the frame, joking like they were about to watch a comedy sketch. Evelyn stood close by, her hands clasped so tightly they turned pale. She looked at her son but said nothing now. She knew Caleb had stepped onto this path, and no words or tears from her could pull him back. All she could do was pray that his calm would be enough to weather the storm of mockery surrounding them. Caleb placed the marker on the board and began writing the first symbols. His strokes were slightly shaky at first, but clear and deliberate. Laughter erupted immediately, crashing into him. Look at that, just a few lines and he's already shaking. But he didn't stop. His hand moved faster, math symbols flowing like a steady pulse. He began writing capital flow equations, restructuring the chain of misaligned formulas from the company's flawed report. The noise gradually died down. Some people squinted at the board, trying to follow. A few realized he wasn't scribbling randomly. Every symbol followed complex mathematical structures they had studied in college. One financial analyst murmured almost involuntarily, This is a compound interest sequence." The comment made several nearby people frown and fall silent. Victor tried to break the shifting focus by laughing dryly. "See this? A kid doodling on a board is enough to impress you all. Pathetic." But at that moment, Caleb kept writing, his hand moving swiftly, long lines of symbols appearing on the board, each connected by a clear logic, not a single sign of confusion. He didn't look up, didn't answer a single taunt. In his eyes, there was nothing left but the numbers and the rules they obeyed. The crowd gradually fell silent. The laughter and chatter faded into scattered whispers. Another employee pulled up a chair, eyes fixed on the board. More and more gazes shifted toward the whiteboard, expressions of mockery turning into narrowed looks of analysis. Silence spread like a heavy fog across the grand lobby. Only the sound of the marker scratching against the board remained, each stroke cutting into the pride of those watching. Caleb paused for a moment, glancing at the nearly filled board. He flexed his wrist slightly, then continued writing the next line, introducing the critical transformation to prove that the capital flow was not negative, contrary to the company's report. A quiet woe escaped from the back row, where a seasoned analyst stood. The man muttered without thinking, "This formula. It's the only way to fix that error." A few heads snapped toward him, eyes wide with shock and annoyance, as if to scold him for speaking aloud. Victor clenched his fists, forcing a strained smile. He shouted, voice sharp as a blade, "Enough! This is just a kid scribbling nonsense. Don't be fooled." But no one was laughing anymore. The murmurs took over, and many eyes remained glued to the whiteboard, where Caleb kept completing the calculations. The boy wrote the final line, then lowered the marker. The whiteboard was now packed with formulas and complex symbols, but to those who could read them, it was like a key unlocking a door that had been sealed shut for months. The silence was so complete, a pin drop could have been heard. The crowd that once treated this as a joke now stood frozen, unsure whether to keep mocking or admit what they had just witnessed. Evelyn looked at her son, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't understand the math, but she understood the steady look in his eyes, understood that Caleb had poured all his intellect into shielding them from humiliation. For the first time in her life, her own weakness was replaced by the quiet strength of a child everyone had labeled small and insignificant. No one said a word. Phones were still raised, live stream still running, but the viewers were no longer laughing. Instead, a stunned silence filled the screen, along with a flood of comments. "Who is this kid? What's happening over there? Did the janitor's son really write that formula?" Victor took a deep breath, trying to regain control, but his eyes betrayed confusion. Caleb didn't look at him, didn't look at anyone. He took a step back, set the marker down, and raised his head. In that moment, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a verdict. A child had turned a whiteboard into a bomb that blew apart the arrogance of an entire corporation, and from this point forward, nothing could go back to the way it was. The whiteboard was still covered in fresh ink when Victor suddenly charged forward. He lunged like a provoked animal, his large hand swinging out to snatch the marker from Caleb's grip. His voice cracked like thunder. "Enough. You've stained my company too much." The shout echoed across the lobby, startling even the employees who had stood silently. The marker dropped to the floor, rolled a few times, and left a small trail of ink, like physical proof of the rage boiling over. Caleb stepped back half a pace but didn't flinch. He lifted his head, eyes blazing, and spoke with a voice steady and sharp. "You're the ones who've dirtied this company." His words weren't loud, but they landed like a direct blow to the pride of everyone watching. The live streamers froze for a second, hands trembling as they gripped their phones, because they had just heard a child insult the entire system in the center of the lobby. Evelyn rushed forward in a panic, her arms instinctively shielding her son like a mother prepared to take every arrow in his place. Her face was tight, her eyes burning as she stared at Victor, and in her gaze there was no longer just fear but fury, years of it, built from being treated as less than human. She shouted, voice breaking, "Don't you touch my son." The sound was hoarse but piercing, slicing through every whisper in the room. The whole room shifted into chaos. The mocking laughter had vanished, replaced by a messy mix of shock, anger, and curiosity. Phones were raised higher to capture every second. Someone whispered, "This kid's got guts, calling out Victor like that." Another murmured, "But what if he's actually right?" The tension stretched thin as a wire, and it felt like one wrong move would snap it all apart. Victor stood frozen for a moment, eyes wide, face flushed red with rage. Never in his life had a child, let alone a janitor's child, spoken to him like that. He stepped closer, his face nearly touching theirs, and growled through clenched teeth, "What did you just say, you piece of trash?" Caleb stood tall, didn't move back, and answered clearly enough for the whole room to hear, "I said you're the ones who've dirtied this company, not me." The words hit, and the crowd gasped in unison. The whispers had shifted from mockery to something more electric. A few younger employees clenched their fists, torn between awe and fear, because they knew that challenge had struck at a truth too long ignored. Someone muttered, "He's finished. Victor will crush him." But something had already started to shift. Contempt began to morph into doubt, into curiosity, and in a few eyes, even a hint of respect. Victor refused to let the moment shift away from him. He shouted, pointing straight at the whiteboard, "This is a billion-dollar company, not a place for some no-name kid to scribble. This boy is putting on a show, don't let him waste your time any longer." But just as he finished, a middle-aged employee in the back spoke up, voice trembling, "But everything he wrote matches the exact error we've been trying to trace." The words landed like a stone tossed into stormy water. The crowd stirred, eyes quickly turning from Victor to Caleb, and suspicion began to spread. Evelyn held her son tightly, but Caleb gently touched her arm, as if to calm her. He stepped forward half a pace, standing face to face with Victor, without a trace of hesitation. "You can erase what I wrote, you can throw us out, but the truth is still there. The numbers won't disappear just because you don't like me." A few people swallowed hard. That didn't sound like a child anymore. It sounded like someone pulling the mask off a lie. Victor clenched his teeth and threw the marker he'd picked up back to the floor, trying to maintain dominance. But more and more eyes were no longer on him. They were locked on Caleb, the boy who stood straight under pressure without lowering his gaze. The noise in the room had changed. It was no longer cheap laughter, but tension, anticipation, as if everyone was waiting to see how this would end. In that moment, Victor realized he no longer had full control. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes, but he tried to hide it behind a yell, "Get out, before I call security." Yet even that threat had lost its weight. Someone whispered, "If he kicks them out, it means he's scared the kid is right." The shadow of truth had begun to creep in, pushing Victor further from the safe ground he once owned. Evelyn pulled Caleb closer, but this time she didn't look at him with fear. She saw the fire in his eyes and recognized it as the very thing she had been missing her whole life. And in that moment, mother and son stood like a single wall, facing contempt, facing fury, without a trace of the trembling that once held them back. The room grew louder, voices rising like crashing waves. Some people mumbled that the company needed to review its report. Others protested loudly, but no one saw it as a joke anymore. A child had punctured the mask of pride, turning the grand lobby into a place of reckoning. And in the middle of that chaos, Victor Hale, the man once thought untouchable, was the first to show signs of despair. In that moment, truth had stepped into the room, and no one could force it back out. The chaos in the lobby hadn't settled when a flood of internal notifications began popping up on the phones and computers of employees across the upper floors. A short livestream clip of Caleb writing formulas spread like ink in water, drawing in dozens, then hundreds of viewers within minutes. People buzzed with speculation, some mocking, others stunned, and more than a few beginning to re-examine the numbers that had weighed down the company for months. The rumor, janitor's son writes $100 million formula, spread like wildfire, shooting straight up to the executive offices. On the top floor, the CEO's conference room was dead silent, save for the furious clacking of a keyboard and the non-stop ringing of phones. Richard Cole, a man known for his cold logic and rigid discipline, stepped out of his office with a grave expression. He had heard the whispers, but didn't believe them until a staff member rushed over and held up a phone streaming the scene live. The board was covered in equations. The crowd surrounded the boy. Victor was shouting uncontrollably, and the small child stood still, completely unshaken. Richard frowned, suspicion flashing in his eyes, then strode into his private elevator, leaving behind a room frozen in disbelief. When the elevator doors opened, the atmosphere in the lobby snapped tight. Those who had just been shouting or laughing fell silent, stiffening as if any sound could become evidence against them. Richard stepped directly into the crowd, his icy gaze cutting across every face. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone silenced the entire space. Then he spoke, his voice low and heavy, each word like lead. "Explain this, Victor." Victor Hale froze for a split second, then quickly forced a crooked, insincere smile. His voice rose, trying to bury the panic in his chest. "Sir, it's just a disrespectful kid causing a scene. He scribbled nonsense, trying to grab attention. I'll remove him immediately to protect the company's reputation." He swung his hand toward Caleb as if to drag him away, but stopped when Richard turned his eyes on him with a chilling glare. The air was sharp enough to cut. Richard didn't respond to Victor's excuse right away. He turned slowly, letting his eyes rest on the whiteboard. For a moment, his face stiffened. The numbers and symbols were woven into complex equations that covered the board. This wasn't a child's doodle, nor a prank. It was a clear structure, grounded in mathematical logic any educated person would recognize. Richard's jaw tightened, the corner of his mouth twitched slightly, and the calm control he was known for seemed to falter. He stepped back half a pace, eyes still fixed on the board, then glanced at Caleb, who stood silently but with a fire burning in his eyes. The crowd watched every movement. Some employees broke into a cold sweat, knowing that if the CEO acknowledged the value of what the boy had written, then all their earlier mockery would become a permanent stain. Others held their breath, waiting for a verdict. Evelyn stood close to her son, her hand gripping Caleb's wrist tightly, as if trying to give him strength. She didn't fully understand the meaning of the equations, but she could see the shift in Richard's eyes, and she could feel that the truth had just reached the highest level of power. Victor still tried to maintain control. He raised his voice, sharper now. "Mr. Richard, this is an insult. A boy who only knows how to follow his mother and mop floors dares to stand here writing formulas no one understands. I strongly suggest we erase this immediately and take action before the public turns our company into a joke." But his words were no longer met with supportive laughter. Instead, silence took over, broken only by heavy breathing and hesitant glances from the bystanders. Richard didn't take his eyes off the board. In his mind, fragments of data began to realign, and the negative figures in the company's financial reports slowly revealed their true origin. He lifted his gaze, looked straight at Victor, then slowly turned to Caleb. His stare was sharp and unreadable, as if probing, but beneath it was a flicker of unmistakable astonishment. A child had just done what a room full of experts might not have. The air was so thick with tension that it made everyone's throat feel dry. Caleb stayed silent. He didn't add a word. He simply stood beside his mother, his dark eyes carrying a strange, quiet calm. He knew what he had written didn't need defending. The numbers spoke for themselves. Every symbol on that board struck like a hammer against the corporation's pride, and now, the CEO himself was the one forced to confront it. In that moment, the entire lobby waited for a single word from Richard. One word could decide the fate of Evelyn and her son, the reputation of Victor, and possibly the way the whole company would see itself. The silence stretched, each heartbeat growing heavier. Finally, Richard took a long breath, his eyes still locked on the board, his face tightening, as if struggling to contain something shaking inside him. And by not speaking immediately, he had already admitted what was written on that board was anything but simple. The entire room sank into a heavy suspense, like the stillness before a storm. And in every person's mind, one question echoed: would the CEO stand with the truth, or crush it to protect power and pride? The air was thick with tension, and every eye was fixed on the whiteboard. The lines Caleb had written were still fresh, the ink not yet dry, each stroke clean and precise, forming an undeniable chain of logic. The lobby was so silent that the hum of the ventilation system could be heard. Suddenly, a middle-aged financial staff member who had been standing quietly in the crowd stepped forward, hand trembling as he pointed to the board. His voice rang out clearly, filled with anxiety but also certainty. "Mr. CEO, this is the capital flow solution. These equations solve the exact bottleneck in our reports." His words tore straight through the silence like a blade. The crowd erupted, whispers spreading like wildfire. Those who had mocked Caleb now turned to the board again, no longer with ridicule but with shock. Some furrowed their brows, eyes darting across the formulas, searching for flaws, but they found none. These weren't childish scribbles. They were a complete solution, one that their own experts had failed to produce. Victor Hale's face drained of color. He stormed forward, face flushed, sweat breaking on his forehead. His voice cracked with rage, nearly a scream. "Impossible. A kid couldn't write this. He must have stolen company data, or someone handed it to him. This is a fraud." He glanced at Richard, hoping for agreement, but the CEO's gaze did not shift. It only grew colder. Caleb stood still, his expression calm and untouched by the shouting. He turned and looked directly at Victor, eyes bright, voice clear and firm. "I didn't steal anything. I just saw what you chose to ignore." His words landed like a slap, and the crowd broke into scattered murmurs. Some looked at one another and, in that moment, realized the raw truth in his statement. Perhaps it was arrogance and stubbornness at the top that had dragged the company down, not some outsider. Richard Cole slowly stepped toward a nearby table, picked up the thick stack of financial reports that had driven the company into crisis. He flipped through the pages, eyes scanning the glaring red figures, then looked up again at the whiteboard. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. He set the report down with a sharp, decisive thud, and his voice rang out, low and heavy. "This boy is right." That declaration struck like thunder, shattering the suffocating atmosphere. For a few seconds, the crowd stood frozen, then erupted into chaos. Some stared in disbelief, mouths agape, others muttered in shock, and a few hung their heads in shame, recalling their earlier mockery. The lobby had become a battleground of clashing emotions, cries of denial from those who couldn't accept it, mixed with quiet cheers from those brave enough to embrace the truth. Victor was nearly losing his mind. He lunged toward Richard, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't believe a kid. You're the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation. How can you rely on the scribbles of some low-class janitor's son?" He pointed directly at Caleb, eyes bloodshot. But Richard didn't look at Victor. He stood still, his gaze fixed on the boy quietly holding his mother's hand. It was that calm, the complete contrast to Victor's frenzy, that made it clear who truly held the power now. Evelyn gripped Caleb's hand tightly, tears rising, but she did not break. For the first time in her life, she watched the most powerful man in the company acknowledge her son's worth. The murmurs still swirled around them, but to her they sounded like wind passing through. In that moment, all that mattered was the image of Caleb standing tall, head unbowed, and the heavy confirmation spoken by Richard Cole. Veteran employees who had once looked down on Evelyn suddenly found it hard to breathe. They remembered their laughter, the words they used to humiliate her, and now those very words tightened like a collar around their necks. One muttered, voice thick with regret, "We just mocked the person who saved the company." The sentence hung awkwardly in the air but hit many hearts, leaving a cut no excuse could erase. Victor was still shouting, but his voice faded, swallowed by the noise around him. The name Caleb Brooks had already been spoken by the CEO, along with the word right, and nothing could erase that truth. The child they had tried to crush was now holding a power greater than any threat they could offer. The company's grand lobby was no longer a place of mockery, but the birthplace of an undeniable truth, a massive crack in the wall of corporate pride. The moment Richard acknowledged the boy, the company's history shifted, and no one in that room could turn away from what had just happened. Caleb was no longer just a janitor's son. He had become the one who exposed the weakness hidden beneath the polished surface, and from that revelation, the spark of change had begun to rise. The moment Richard Cole spoke his confirmation, the atmosphere in the lobby exploded like a storm. The murmurs turned into loud outbursts. Some senior employees jumped to their feet, faces flushed with indignation. One slammed his hand on a table so hard the water glass on it splashed, his voice booming. "This is unacceptable. We can't let some kid humiliate the entire financial world." His outcry sparked a chain of similar reactions from every direction, the scraping of chairs on the floor screeching like steel on steel. Victor Hale seized the chaos as his chance to reclaim control. He roared, face twisted with rage, "Fine. If he's right, I resign on the spot. I'll never be associated with this company again." The bold declaration echoed through the lobby, at first landing like a challenge meant to dominate. But within seconds, the crowd began to whisper, doubt creeping in. Everyone knew Victor had spoken in fury, but the words were already out, and with so many witnesses and live streams recording, his vow had become a noose around his own neck. Richard gave him no escape. He turned, his stare cutting into the sweating manager like a blade. His voice came low and cold. "A man keeps his word." The sentence dropped with weight, sealing the trap. The room fell silent for a moment, as if waiting to see whether Victor would break his promise. Harsh breaths filled the space. Some people looked away, others stared straight at him, expecting a response. Victor tried to speak, but his throat caught, his face drained of color, fists clenched and trembling. Amid the tension, Caleb showed no pride or excitement. He bowed his head, his small hand gripping the edge of his mother's shirt, and whispered softly, only loud enough for Evelyn to hear, "I just wanted to prove that intelligence doesn't need permission to walk in." That whisper carried both innocence and an enormous inner strength. Evelyn froze, tears sliding down her cheek, not from fear or shame this time, but from a rising pride that took her breath away. She knew her son didn't want to be a hero or the center of attention. He only wanted to shield her from contempt and prove that truth could be spoken anywhere. The arguments reignited, sharper than before. Someone shouted, "We can't let a child lecture us." Another voice shot back, "But numbers don't lie," he pointed out the flaw. Two opposing sides clashed, turning the lobby into an invisible battlefield. Some stood to defend the honor of their profession, and others leaned toward the undeniable truth on the whiteboard. The divide showed clearly in every glance, every furrowed brow. Victor, cornered with no way out, kept flailing. He shouted, jabbing his finger wildly at Caleb. He's just a kid, no degree, no education, no authority. We can't let him walk in here and ruin everything. But the more he yelled, the more strained and bitter his voice became, revealing his desperation. Those who had once backed him fell quiet, some now avoiding Richard's gaze, unwilling to be tied to a man who had made such a reckless vow. Richard stood tall, face unreadable. He took it all in, listening to every argument, but his focus remained on Victor and Caleb. On one side was crumbling arrogance. On the other hand, calm that far exceeded the boy's age. In that moment, it was obvious who held the trust, who truly represented the company. Evelyn held her son's shoulder tightly, her eyes scanning the room, seeing the shift unfold. The years of humiliation began to dissolve, replaced by glances now filled with something else. Some looked down, others gave the smallest nods, quiet acknowledgments that felt almost like apologies. The truth had risen, and once the CEO confirmed it, no amount of laughter or insult could bury it again. The lobby had turned into a public courtroom. Victor stood as the accused, Caleb, the unintentional witness, and Richard the only judge with the power to rule. The clicks of phone keyboards and the flood of live-streamed comments rolled in like crashing waves. Outside the company, the world was surely watching every word, every gesture. And in that moment, the once mighty corporation lost its prideful shield, exposing the truth that a janitor's child had just saved it from collapse. The shock rippled from the top floors to the bottom. Those who once believed themselves untouchable now saw that power could be shaken by a mind small in size but pure in intent. Silence spread again. But this time not from contempt. This time, it was the silence of bitter recognition. And in the center of that grand lobby, Caleb Brooks had become the unexpected symbol of a truth too clear to deny any longer. The phone of a young employee who had recorded Caleb writing on the whiteboard became the spark that ignited a media wildfire. In moments, the live stream was shared across platforms, with the headline, "Janitor's Son Solves $100 M, Problem Flooding Timelines." People rushed to watch it, and views skyrocketed from dozens to thousands, then hundreds of thousands in a single afternoon. The image of the small boy writing symbols that silenced an entire lobby, followed by CEO Richard Cole declaring, "This boy is right," became the clip's defining moment, looped endlessly across every feed. As the video spread, social media erupted with mixed emotions. Some praised Caleb as a born genius, challenging the entire system. Comments flooded in. "Unbelievable, a kid saw what an entire corporation missed." Others added, "This is real merit." Intelligence can come from anywhere, but alongside admiration came waves of doubt and cynicism. Harsh takes emerged. Are we seriously supposed to believe a janitor's kid outsmarted financial experts? And this must be a PR stunt for the company. The collision of praise and skepticism turned the internet into a massive forum where everyone had something to say. The story quickly caught the attention of online news outlets. Financial headlines rolled out rapidly. Some articles broke down the symbols Caleb had written, with experts weighing in. A math professor declared, "Even without formal training, the formula is sound. This is no fluke." A few analysts cautioned against overhyping the event, but the fact that the video was being watched more than any other clip that day proved its overwhelming pull. Evelyn heard everything through hushed chatter from passing staff and glimpses of glowing phone screens. She was stunned to see her son's face on display, watched by millions, praised, criticized, analyzed. Her heart swelled with both fear and indescribable pride. Caleb sat quietly in a corner of the lobby, ignoring the phones, but his eyes lit up when he heard people passing by whisper, "That boy was right. He was really right." In just a few short hours, the story had broken through the company's walls. Youth forums turned the clip into viral content, adding music, memes, and explosive hashtags. The name Caleb Brooks, side by side with 100 meters problem, shot to the top of search trends. Even people who had never cared about finance were now watching, just to see the image of a janitor's son standing up to a corporation. The fear of missing out pushed the spread even further, turning the clip into an unstoppable wave. Some media experts began pointing out that this was no longer just a company event, it had become a symbol of class confrontation. They analyzed, it's not the $100 million figure that moves the audience, but the visual contrast. A boy from the lowest social rung, daring to stand up to those in power. And as that image was replayed across thousands of screens, it embedded itself in the public's consciousness as a challenge to society. For those inside the company, the video's spread was a true shock. The mocking words they had thrown out that morning had now become permanent evidence, impossible to retract. They were stunned to find criticism aimed directly at them in the comments, their names attached to screenshots showing them laughing at Caleb. Some tried to erase their digital traces, while others fell completely silent, hoping public opinion wouldn't call them out. Meanwhile, Victor Hale was in a state of high alert, making call after call trying to regain control, but the media wave had already surged far beyond his reach. The impact didn't stop at outrage or admiration. It sparked a wider debate about fairness, intelligence, and class division. Someone wrote, "If a boy they mocked could save an entire company, how many talents have we lost just because of where they came from?" That single question echoed in the minds of millions. Caleb, with a simple act on a whiteboard, had forced society to take a long, hard look at itself. The hashtag number, #CleanerKidGenius, first appeared in a mocking tweet, but within hours, it transformed into a widespread symbol across all platforms. It was attached to every image of Caleb, from the moment he held the marker to his unwavering gaze as he stood up to Victor Hale. Each post was shared thousands of times, fueling an unprecedented media storm that pulled even finance-agnostic audiences into the debate. Many social media users highlighted the irony. A poor kid saved a corporation while the men in suits just sat and laughed. That image turned the hashtag into a hub of both admiration and anger, igniting an intense, ongoing public discourse. Online news outlets quickly caught on, using number #CleanerKidGenius to drive traffic. Headlines declared that this event was a textbook case of how society consistently overlooks talent that doesn't come from privilege. Some international magazines translated the hashtag directly, placing it in hot topic sections and pushing the story beyond borders. With every new article, engagement skyrocketed, and within a single evening, the hashtag had entered the list of top global search terms. Meanwhile, inside the company, Victor Hale was nearly out of control. His face flushed red with anger as he saw employees glued to their phones instead of working. His fury peaked when he realized the video wasn't stopping. It was multiplying in various forms. He kept calling the legal department, demanding that the footage be taken down, threatening lawsuits against those who had shared it. But social media obeys no one. Every attempt Victor made to contain the spread only fueled more curiosity and deeper digging from the public. Victor sought support from his close allies, but even they hesitated, unwilling to take a clear stance. Some employees stood silently on the sidelines, watching his authority crumble hour by hour. Frustration turned into fear as Victor began to realize he had become the face of everything wrong with the incident. Every satirical clip now featured him yelling, calling Caleb a disrespectful brat, making his image spiral even further. The more Victor tried to suppress it, the more he failed. Posts he managed to remove were instantly replaced with dozens of copies. Internet users began creating remixed versions, adding music, subtitles, and turning him into a public villain under global scrutiny. Some edited clips even flashed the phrase, "silent if wrong, resign if right," below his face, leaving him humiliated and powerless. Evelyn Brooks sat quietly in a corner, watching it all unfold beyond anything she had ever imagined. She wasn't used to the loudness of the outside world, but as the hashtag number #CleanerKidGenius popped up everywhere, a quiet sense of conviction stirred inside her. Caleb sat beside her, his eyes lit up as he realized the truth could no longer be buried. Though more storms were surely ahead, he knew this battle was no longer a lonely standoff in a company lobby. It had become a story for society itself. While Victor scrambled in a futile effort, the wave of public opinion only spread further. The comments, articles, and hashtags had turned a morning of humiliation into an uncontainable event. And from that moment on, power no longer belonged solely to those in high chairs. It began shifting toward the truth, now guarded by millions. As pressure from the media and social networks reached its peak, Richard Cole was forced to appear in front of the cameras. The press conference was hastily arranged in the company's main conference room, with dozens of microphones and cameras pointed at the podium. Employees crowded the sides, reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, and the air was thick with anticipation. When Richard stepped out in a dark suit, his face tense but maintaining his familiar composure, all noise ceased instantly. He looked straight into the sea of cameras, and his voice rang out clearly. "A boy just saved this company." That sentence sent a jolt through the entire room. The sound of typing filled the air, and camera flashes burst non-stop. Reporters raised their hands in unison, questions raining down like hail. One stood up, voice urgent. "Can you confirm that this boy actually solved the $100 million problem?" Another cut in. "Was this a setup to polish the company's image?" The barrage of questions came fast, dripping with skepticism and satire, echoing the storm of opinions raging outside. Richard didn't rush to respond. He placed both hands on the podium, scanning the crowd, as if to show he understood the pressure and wasn't avoiding it. His voice lowered, slow and deliberate. "What the boy wrote on the whiteboard has been verified. It's accurate, and it points directly to the critical flaw in our financial reports. There was no stolen data, no hidden hand behind it. Just a sharp eye and a remarkable mind." He paused, letting the words settle into the room, then added, "We should not be ashamed of this truth, we should be grateful." That firm statement stirred the room again. A few reporters whispered among themselves, their expressions shifting between surprise and uncertainty. A young journalist from an international outlet raised a microphone and asked, Do you think allowing a janitor's kid to walk in and expose what your team of experts couldn't is a disgrace to the financial industry? The question landed like a knife, sharp and unforgiving. Richard took a breath, his eyes fixed on the reporter, then answered without hesitation. If intelligence comes from a boy we look down on, it doesn't disgrace us, it wakes us up. The shame isn't that he was right, it's that our pride kept us blind for so long. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Some heads bowed, others scribbled furiously, realizing the story had shifted from an internal crisis to a bold societal message. Evelyn sat in the back row, clutching her hands, her heart pounding as her son's name echoed before the public. Caleb sat beside her, still quiet, but his eyes burned bright. He knew the truth had just been defended not only by numbers, but by the words of the most powerful man in the company. In that moment, all the insults and condescension from earlier that morning seemed to fade away. The press conference dragged on, and reporters kept pressing, but Richard's answers had already laid the foundation for a new narrative. He didn't deny the embarrassment or hide the mistakes, instead turning them into a public lesson. That decisiveness led many, even the skeptics, to admit that Caleb Brooks had opened a new chapter for the company, and that sometimes, truth emerges from the most unexpected places. From that conference room, the news spread at lightning speed. Headlines multiplied, quoting Richard's words verbatim, "A boy just saved this company." And so, what began as a mocking video had transformed into a seismic message confirmed before the entire world. Richard looked up, unfazed by the continuous flashes, and said firmly, "The truth cannot be denied." Just 4 words, but they hit the room like a hammer, silencing all whispers and interrupting questions. Hundreds of eyes followed him, some reporters glancing at each other in disbelief that the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation had chosen to speak so bluntly. No polished PR language, no strategic evasion, only a clear, cold, decisive acknowledgement. In that moment, the public was stunned. Those present sat in silence, while millions watching via livestream were equally shaken. Social media flooded with comments. Did he really admit it? This is no longer a rumor. The CEO just said it on camera. That wave of disbelief seeped into every corner, turning what was meant to be a crisis control briefing into a historic event for the company and the finance industry itself. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. Many leaned back in their chairs, breathing hard, knowing that statement had closed every door to denial. It also meant the company's mistakes, arrogance, and blind spots were now exposed to a global audience. Richard stood firm, weariness in his eyes, but steely resolve in his stance, as if he had chosen to place the company on the operating table, inviting outsiders to examine it, rather than continuing to hide the truth. Evelyn Brooks watched quietly from a hallway screen, her hand trembling against her chest. She heard that admission like a gust of wind blowing away the darkness that had long surrounded her and her son. She had grown used to being pushed aside, to swallowing injustice in silence, but now the CEO himself, the man at the summit of power, had spoken aloud what her son had written in numbers. Caleb sat beside her, silent, but his face lit up, eyes locked on the screen as if etching every syllable into memory. Some reporters still tried to challenge the statement, but once the declaration had been made, they realized they could only probe the consequences, not reverse the truth. The flurry of follow-up questions now centered on the company's future, the accountability of its leadership, and how they would change to prevent such failures from happening again. Richard answered briefly, with few words, but his tone was unwavering. There would be no more concealment. The public, who once only cared about falling stock prices or dry financial reports, suddenly saw a different image. A small child, the janitor's son, daring to expose a mistake, and a CEO forced to nod in acknowledgement. The story went beyond numbers. It became a symbol of the clash between underestimated intellect and seemingly untouchable power. That brief statement opened a new path, one where people began to question fairness, opportunity, and the values buried simply because of someone's background. The silence that followed the words, "The truth cannot be denied," was not one of apathy, but of awareness, a shock that made people confront themselves. And from that moment, Caleb Brooks was no longer just a boy standing next to his mother and her cleaning cart. He became a name tied to a truth no one could refute. Just one day after the press conference, major newspapers simultaneously placed Caleb Brooks' story on their front pages. Forbes ran the headline, "Genius Kid Outsmarts Wall Street," accompanied by an image of the boy standing in front of a whiteboard filled with formulas, beside his mother, Evelyn, in her familiar janitor uniform. The contrast struck a nerve with readers, making the article one of the most shared of the week. Forbes didn't just highlight Caleb's discovery of the financial discrepancy, it also explored the deeper context, how a child pushed to the margins managed to overturn an entire system run by seasoned experts. Business Insider followed suit, opening with the headline, "A $100 millionaire solved in seconds," emphasizing that this wasn't merely a story about numbers but a lesson in the complacency of the financial elite. The detailed piece described the event as a textbook example of how even the most powerful companies can be blind to obvious truths when arrogance and bias cloud their judgment. Experts interviewed admitted that what Caleb spotted wasn't overly complex technically, but in an environment dominated by old thinking, it was almost impossible to see. Other media outlets quickly joined in. Some financial analysis sites published detailed diagrams of the equations Caleb had written, illustrating how the boy had mapped the movement of capital. Evening news broadcasts led with the story as a social phenomenon, showing images of millions sharing the hashtag tied to the name Cleaner Kid Genius. Reporters described it as a slap in the face to the pride of American finance and a wake-up call for every institution resting too comfortably on its power. Evelyn listened to the news on a small radio in the staff break room, her ears ringing as the anchor mentioned her son's name with a voice full of reverence. She wasn't used to the noise of public attention, but when she saw Caleb's bright smile watching the broadcast, her heart swelled with a mix of pride and unease. She knew the spotlight could bring honor but also danger, because public praise meant every step she and her son took would now be watched closely. Meanwhile, the public read and debated non-stop. The analytical articles fueled curiosity, and people began to talk not only about Caleb's brilliance, but also about the company's responsibility. One reader commented, "If a kid could spot the flaw, why didn't the highly paid experts?" Another wrote, "This proves that intelligence isn't determined by background, only arrogance makes us blind." Those words were reshared widely, becoming a social message far beyond the original story. The media firestorm pushed Victor Hale further into crisis. Footage of him shouting in front of the whiteboard was edited and spread everywhere, sharply contrasting with Caleb's calm gaze. Every article portrayed Victor as the quintessential villain blinded by power. He attempted to defend himself with a few public statements, but the more he spoke, the harsher the backlash became. The public no longer believed his excuses. They saw only a man terrified of the truth being dragged into the light. Each day, the news dug deeper. Reporters interviewed Caleb's former teachers, neighbors from Evelyn's apartment complex, and even unearthed small anecdotes about the mother and son's life. Images of the quiet woman working in the background, her face weathered but eyes glowing with pride beside her genius child, became a symbol that the media eagerly amplified. The attention was no longer just about a financial mistake, but had turned into a heartfelt story of motherhood and resilience from society's margins. All of America, and soon the rest of the world, began following each new development. What Forbes and Business Insider had published did more than report facts. They solidified Caleb Brooks's image as a social phenomenon, a living proof that intelligence could shatter the boundaries of birth and status. And once the media had delved this deep, it was clear the story couldn't be reversed. It could only keep spreading, bringing consequences no one could fully predict. Ordinary people, who once paid little attention to dry financial reports, now rushed to share the video and articles praising Caleb. Across social media, his image standing before the whiteboard flooded news feeds, accompanied by heartfelt captions like, "This is true genius," or, "If this boy can do it, my child can dream bigger too." Many parents reposted the clip with messages to their children, turning it into a rallying story of hope that opportunity isn't reserved for those born into wealth. Workers, drivers, and janitorial staff across the country left comments, saying they saw themselves in Evelyn, and her son's light felt like a shared source of comfort for everyone who had ever been looked down on. The ripple effect grew quickly. Online community forums posted countless stories of people's personal experiences being underestimated because of their jobs or backgrounds, using Caleb as proof that intelligence isn't confined by social rank. Each share sparked dozens of comments, and many admitted they had cried, watching the boy bravely confront the jeering crowd. Some even sent emails to Richard Cole's company, demanding that the executives issue a formal apology to Evelyn and acknowledge Caleb as a talent who deserved real support. While the story outside continued to explode, Evelyn quietly carried on with her usual work. She bent over the floor, dragging the mop in familiar strokes, her breathing steady, revealing nothing of the emotions welling up inside her chest. People walked past in the hallway, chatting excitedly, their phones lit up with images of Caleb, but she simply listened in silence, never joining the conversation. A faint smile flickered across her face, quickly hidden beneath her usual calm. It was the smile of quiet pride, the kind only a mother wears when she knows her son has done something no one else dared to imagine. Evelyn recalled the chaotic morning when Caleb had a rag thrown at his feet and endured every kind of humiliation. Now, those who once laughed had become the very subjects of public backlash. She didn't need apologies or recognition, but as she bent to clean the floor, she felt her shoulders lighten, as if the burden of years had been lifted by her son's few strokes of chalk on a whiteboard. With every sweep of the mop across the polished surface, she felt as though she was erasing traces of contempt, leaving behind a floor that now reflected a new kind of light. Caleb followed his mother, but unlike before, he no longer walked with his head down. He walked beside her, eyes forward, occasionally pausing to glance at phone screens glowing with his own name. He didn't fully grasp the scale of what had happened, but he knew his mother had smiled. And for him, that alone was enough to make every moment of exhaustion, every mocking word he'd ever heard, lose all meaning. The story spread farther than anyone had imagined, but deep down, Caleb's most important anchor remained Evelyn's quiet grip on his hand. She didn't need to shout her pride aloud. Simply continuing her familiar task, hiding a smile in her bright eyes, she said everything that mattered. And that simple image once again underscored a truth. The power of intellect isn't only found in the formulas on a board, but in the humble place it begins, where a mother quietly does a job deemed unworthy while her son slowly changes how the world sees it. While public opinion outside leaned heavily in favor of Caleb and Evelyn, Victor Hale refused to sit back and let his image be dragged through the mud. He appeared at a closed-door meeting with a few board members, his face gaunt but his eyes burning with resentment. Slamming his hand on the table, Victor barked. Evelyn Brooks used her son to manipulate the situation, turning the company into a tool for self-promotion. He didn't hesitate to smear them, claiming the entire event had been orchestrated, that the viral video was just a stunt to pressure the company into elevating an outsider. His accusations were swiftly noted down, and the atmosphere in the room thickened with suspicion. A few board members exchanged glances. They didn't fully believe Victor, but the pressure from the media and shareholders had everyone on edge. No one had foreseen a child becoming the center of global attention, and for people more accustomed to protecting reputations than confronting truths, Victor's baseless claims still planted seeds of doubt. One member spoke coldly. "We need to get clarity. If this company stays tied to that hashtag, our brand value will suffer." And with that single sentence, the decision to open an internal investigation was made. As the internal leak spread, employees buzzed with unrest. Some voiced frustration. Investigate what? We saw Caleb write the formula with our own eyes. Others, wary of the board's power, kept quiet and focused on their tasks. The same media outlets that had praised Caleb now added a quiet line to their reports. The board of directors will investigate potential misconduct in the case. Public opinion quickly fractured. Half the audience was outraged, calling it a cowardly attempt to suppress the truth, while the other half hesitated, wondering if someone had orchestrated everything behind the scenes. Evelyn heard the news from a former coworker, her grip on the mop tightening until her knuckles turned white. She hadn't even had time to fully savor her pride before being pulled back into the pit of scorn. She didn't know how to explain it to Caleb, who had only wanted to prove his worth through numbers. But Caleb, upon hearing her recount the news, stayed silent for a moment before replying calmly, "I was right. They can investigate all they want. The numbers won't change." His composure choked Evelyn with emotion, and she knew this time they weren't just facing laughter in a lobby, but an entire system trying to crush them. Victor felt triumphant when the decision was finalized. He believed that as long as Evelyn and Caleb were pulled into a web of suspicion, public support would eventually erode. He whispered to reporters, leaking internal sources, suggesting that the mother and son had attempted to approach multiple employees, hinting at suspicious timing around Caleb's appearance. Though he had no proof, the rumors alone were enough to widen the cracks in public trust. Richard Cole watched everything unfold from his office, his expression growing somber. He said nothing, but he understood clearly this was Victor's final counterattack. Richard knew the board wouldn't easily side with Caleb, because they cared more about dividends and stock prices than justice. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table, a flicker of resolve in his eyes, knowing that the truth couldn't be twisted forever. And once the investigation began, Victor himself wouldn't escape scrutiny. While the silent war played out in the upper ranks, the public continued to debate. Some angrily declared online, "They're trying to silence a rising star." Others were more cautious, saying, "If he's truly innocent, Caleb will prove it." The controversy only fueled the fire, turning every move the board made into a public spectacle. The investigation hadn't even begun, yet it had already become a societal focal point, where every word and action from Victor and his supporters would be intensely scrutinized. And in the heart of that storm, Evelyn knew she and her son had to brace for a battle even harsher than the morning they were mocked in the company lobby. Richard frowned, his gaze sweeping the tense boardroom. His voice rang out, each word deliberate and sharp. "Who's really abusing power here?" No one dared breathe too loudly, because they knew the question wasn't aimed at Evelyn and Caleb, as Victor had hoped, but rather at those twisting the truth to serve their own ends. A heavy silence fell. Some board members lowered their eyes to shuffle papers, avoiding Richard's stare. Others parted their lips as if to speak, then quickly fell quiet. Victor tried to maintain composure, but beads of sweat dotted his forehead, and his hands fidgeted restlessly. He knew the question had turned attention squarely onto him, because images of him shouting, threatening, and swearing boldly had already circulated far and wide. No one had spoken an accusation aloud, but the eyes surrounding him made him feel like he was already cornered. Caleb sat beside his mother, so quiet he almost seemed invisible amid the noise, but he remained unshaken, his gaze resting calmly on the hands folded in his lap. His silence wasn't fear, it was the quiet confidence of someone who knew the evidence still lived on that whiteboard. Untouchable. In his mind, the numbers remained sharp and orderly, a reminder that truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. It carries enough weight to crush every excuse. Evelyn sat close to her son, filled with pride and tenderness as she watched his calm. She squeezed her hands, wanting to shield him, but she also sensed he no longer needed her protection like before. Caleb, through his quiet resolve, had created a stillness that made the powerful men in the room uneasy. She had never imagined her son would one day sit before a board of directors and remain composed, while the adults fumbled with fear and uncertainty. Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping slowly on the table. He knew he was caught between two opposing forces. On one side, the demand to preserve the company's image. On the other, the undeniable power of truth. When he raised the question about abuse of power, he had sent a clear signal that he had no intention of turning the investigation into a witch hunt. The sharper minds in the room understood that, and they began glancing at one another, exchanging looks as if reassessing their positions in the game. Victor forced a smile, his voice stiff. "I'm only fulfilling my duty to protect the company." But in that thick, heavy atmosphere, the words sounded more like a hollow excuse than a justification. Richard didn't respond. He let the silence stretch, forcing everyone to reflect. Images of the boy speaking clearly before the crowd, the unmistakable formulas on the board, and the unfulfilled resignation promise Victor had made all resurfaced in the minds of the board members, gradually making them realize who had truly embarrassed the company. Caleb lifted his head, his eyes briefly meeting Richard's. The look wasn't pleading, nor was it defiant, it was simply calm, as if to say he didn't need to be believed, the numbers would speak for themselves. That silence did more to command attention than any defense could. The composure of that small boy had become a mirror, reflecting the turmoil of the grown men unraveling around him. The meeting ended without a final resolution, but Richard's question still hung in the air. Who's really abusing power here? And though the answer hadn't been spoken aloud, it seemed painfully clear. Caleb left the room with his mother, their steps steady and composed, while Victor remained seated, his face ashen, knowing that the balance had begun to shift toward the truth. That afternoon, after the board meeting ended in suffocating tension, Richard Cole summoned Caleb to his private office. The spacious room, with towering glass walls overlooking the city, was bathed in fading afternoon light, casting a somber tone over everything. Caleb entered quietly, walking beside his mother, but Richard motioned for Evelyn to wait outside in the hallway. The door closed, leaving only the powerful man and the boy who had shaken the entire company. Richard stood by his desk, one hand resting lightly on a file, his expression stern but not without curiosity. His voice was low. "Do you know what you've just done?" Caleb looked up, his gaze steady and unafraid. He paused, then answered calmly, "I just corrected a calculation." The short reply cut through the layers of arrogance like a blade, and Richard was momentarily taken aback. He hadn't expected a child to sum up such a monumental event in such effortless words. But that simplicity made him pause, because to Caleb, what had just happened wasn't a power struggle, it was simply an act of setting the truth straight. Richard sat down, removed his glasses, his eyes never leaving Caleb. "Do you understand that those numbers you wrote saved this company from a massive loss? And at the same time, you exposed several people, including Victor, to public embarrassment." He paused, waiting for a reaction. Caleb remained composed, his fingers loosely interlocked, and answered slowly, "If the truth embarrasses them, that's not my fault." The room fell silent, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Richard leaned back, his gaze softening, a mix of admiration and concern in his eyes. "You have an extraordinary mind, but you must understand that this world isn't ruled by numbers alone. It's also ruled by pride, by power, by the fear of those who are losing their place. What you've done has ripped off that mask, and now you'll be seen as a threat by many." Caleb turned to the window, where the sunlight was fading, then looked back and answered in a soft but steady voice, "I don't want to be a threat, I just want things to be what they're supposed to be." That response kept Richard silent for a long while. He realized the conviction in the boy's eyes wasn't something he often saw in seasoned executives, but the clarity of someone whose spirit hadn't yet been clouded by power. Richard tapped his fingers gently on the table, then sighed. "You know, from now on, every step you take will be watched. People won't let this go easily." Caleb nodded slightly. "I know, but if I have to stay silent just to be left alone, then I wouldn't be myself anymore." That answer made Richard smile faintly, a rare smile, equal parts resignation and respect. In this boy, he He saw something the entire corporation had been missing: the courage to speak the truth, even when it meant standing alone. The conversation ended in silence. Richard stood, walked toward the door, then turned to look at Caleb. "You have a gift few people possess, but remember, standing up for the truth is never an easy road." Caleb nodded, saying nothing more. As the door opened, Evelyn was already waiting, her eyes full of worry. Caleb stepped out, calm as if he had just taken a test, while Richard remained inside the vast office, quietly reflecting on the boy's brief but weighty response. "I just corrected a calculation." Richard sat back in his chair, his eyes resting on the tall glass window framing the crimson evening sky. He said nothing more, letting the silence stretch, as if replaying each word that had just come from the boy's mouth. Then, on the face so accustomed to sternness, a rare smile slowly appeared, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't a smile to reassure anyone, nor one meant for display, but a genuine response to the surprise of seeing a child so unwavering. Richard rarely smiled at on-time reports or successful contracts, but today, a single, simple reply from Caleb had somehow freed him from the familiar grip of pride. That brief smile, though fleeting, marked a shift. It showed that, in the mind of this powerful man, a quiet acknowledgement had begun to take shape, that in the cold world of profit and power, sincerity still had the strength to stir something deep. Richard set the file down on the table, his eyes now carrying a respect too clear to hide, even without saying a word. He knew that from this moment forward, Caleb was no longer just a boy who happened into his life by chance, but someone who had forced him to rethink the way the whole system worked. Meanwhile, in the long hallway leading out of the boardroom, Victor Hale stood quietly, pressed into a corner, eyes sharp as they watched through the narrow crack in the door. He missed nothing, not a gesture from Richard, and that smile was what lit a poisonous flame in his chest. To him, it wasn't admiration, it was a warning bell. A boy he had once mocked could now draw a smile from the CEO, while Victor, who had given his life to the company, had never earned that kind of recognition. Victor's eyes darkened, the corner of his mouth twitching, his hatred clearly visible. He clenched his fists, fingernails digging into his palms. In his mind, images of being challenged by Caleb that morning, being cornered by Richard to keep his promise, spun relentlessly like blades slicing through his pride. His gaze locked onto the boy, now filled with burning resentment, no longer laced with ridicule or mockery. Victor slowly backed away from the door, walking down the long hallway with a weight heavy as stone in his chest. He knew he couldn't attack Caleb outright, not now, not while public opinion stood firmly behind the boy, and Richard had just quietly confirmed his support with that smile. But in his eyes flickered a dangerous glint, as Victor began to imagine other ways, indirect paths to pull Evelyn and her son back down from the light. He would not allow himself to be defeated by a child, and even less would he allow Richard's smile to stand as proof that Victor had been wrong. Elsewhere, Caleb left the office, walking quietly beside his mother. He didn't know that behind the closed door, a rare smile had just been given to him, and out in the hallway, a venomous stare was already fueling dark plans. While he calmly embraced a brief moment of peace, older players had begun calculating their next moves, and that very contrast was the warning. The road ahead would be far from calm, because truth requires not only intellect to be proven, but strength to withstand the looming schemes of those who abuse power. That morning, the company's main auditorium was packed. The LED screen behind the podium lit up with the words, "Town Hall Meeting, Future and Responsibility." Employees from every department, accounting, engineering, marketing, even security had been called in. The air was thick with curiosity, as the name Caleb Brooks had dominated conversation for weeks. When the MC announced, "Please welcome today's speaker, Caleb Brooks," a wave of murmurs rolled through the room like surf. Some in the front rows looked up in surprise, others scoffed under their breath. A few couldn't help whispering, "The janitor's kid on stage?" Caleb walked out, his small frame dwarfed by the towering podium. Evelyn stood in the back row, heart pounding as she watched her son face hundreds of eyes alone. The whispers grew louder, some mocking, some dismissive, a few phones raised to film, as if expecting a comedy act. But there were other gazes too more curious, even respectful, especially from those who had read the analyses in the press, and knew it was Caleb who had saved the company from a massive loss. He placed his hands on the edge of the podium, took a deep breath, and scanned the room. The noise gradually faded as he spoke, his voice clear and steady. "I'm not an expert, and I'm not an employee here. I'm just the child of someone who works quietly in this building, but I believe that truth has value no matter where it comes from, or who it comes from." His opening line drew a deeper hush across the hall, a few people straightening in their seats, eyes sharpening with attention. The murmurs didn't vanish completely, but they softened. A staffer in the middle shook his head and whispered, "A kid talking about truth to the whole company. It's strange." The person next to him replied quietly, "But what he wrote on the board, wasn't it accurate?" The divide was clear in every row, like two undercurrents, colliding just beneath the surface. Evelyn watched her son, her eyes burning. She had never imagined Caleb would one day stand at a podium, let alone speak to those who once looked down on them. Her hands were clenched, not from fear this time, but to hold in the pride surging inside her. On stage, Caleb showed no trace of nerves. He stood tall, continuing calmly, "I'm not here to brag, and I'm not here to shame anyone. I just want to remind you that this company must be willing to face its mistakes, not hide them behind silence." Those words fell like cold water across the crowd. Some frowned, perhaps feeling exposed, while others lowered their heads, silently admitting the boy had said what they hadn't dared to. That public stage became more than just a platform for Caleb, it became a mirror, forcing everyone to take a hard look at themselves. And from the back row, Evelyn knew that her son had now stepped onto a path from which there was no turning back. Caleb paused for a moment, his eyes locking onto the sea of faces before him, then spoke clearly, each word ringing across the auditorium. "Numbers don't know skin color." The simple sentence struck straight at the deepest layer of conflict, where long-held contempt had stemmed more from prejudice than actual value. The mocking whispers that had lingered in the air suddenly fell silent, and a few smirking faces froze in place, unsure how to respond to such a blunt truth. A brief, heavy silence spread, thick and tense, until a single clap broke out from the back row. At first scattered, then more joined in, louder and stronger, until the entire auditorium echoed with thunderous applause, drowning out the jeers that had filled the room moments before. Evelyn sat at the back of the hall, her hands slowly joining the rhythm of the clapping. Her chest swelled with a feeling she couldn't quite name, a mix of pride and overwhelming emotion. She remembered all the years spent hunched over staircases, scrubbing floors in silence, enduring whispers and snide remarks, never imagining a day when applause this loud would be for her son. Her vision blurred, but her lips held a firm smile, as if to etch this rare moment into memory. Caleb stood on the stage, neither beaming nor smug, only nodding slightly, as if to acknowledge that he had voiced something everyone knew but few dared to say. In the crowd, some of the employees who had laughed the loudest now felt heat rising to their necks. They looked down, pretending to check their phones or take notes, but couldn't shake the feeling of being quietly exposed. The applause grew stronger, turning into a wave that swept across the room, washing away the sharp tones of mockery that once ruled. A few people stood up completely, clapping until their palms reddened, their eyes fixed on Caleb with newfound respect. Richard Cole sat in the front row, his expression steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of satisfaction. He knew this was the moment the company had truly changed, not because a report had been corrected, but because a boy had cut through the fog of prejudice. He let the applause go on without interrupting, understanding that these sounds needed to echo long enough to leave a mark on everyone's memory. Caleb looked around the auditorium, saw resistance in some eyes, but didn't let it bother him. He understood that not everyone could be convinced, but if even one truth was accepted, then the power of mockery would begin to fade. In that moment, he no longer felt small, no longer surrounded by the towering walls of authority. On the stage, Caleb stood as living proof that truth could break through any barrier and that intellect does not bow to prejudice. The final round of applause faded, leaving a lingering resonance across the auditorium. Many faces had changed. The way they looked at Evelyn and Caleb now carried less contempt, replaced by consideration, even respect. In Evelyn's heart, that moment felt like a rainstorm washing away the burden of years, allowing her to hold her head high as she returned to pushing the familiar cleaning cart. As for Caleb, he knew this was only the beginning, but it was a beginning strong enough to make those who once dismissed him think twice, and to give those who had stayed silent the courage to finally speak up. In the days following Caleb's speech, while public debate still echoed around the phrase, "Numbers don't know skin color," a series of internal documents was unexpectedly leaked. These weren't baseless rumors, but actual reports bearing Victor Hale's signature, clearly showing figures had been altered to conceal a massive financial loss. Copies circulated inside the company, then quickly reached the press, turning Victor from the one demanding an investigation into the subject of one. The news spread like wildfire, with every leaked document compared against original data revealing glaring discrepancies, and Victor's name appeared again and again in headline after headline. At an emergency meeting, when board members confronted him directly, Victor flushed, jumped to his feet, and gripped the folder in his trembling hands. His voice came out strained, part defiant, part pleading. "I did it for the company. If I hadn't made the adjustments, investors would have pulled out, the market would have crashed, and we had no time to react." His words echoed through the pressure-filled room, making a few members hesitate. The fear of loss had haunted them for months, and Victor was exploiting that fear to justify himself. But not everyone was so easily swayed. One board member flipped through the pages, speaking firmly. "You had no right to distort the truth, not even to keep the market calm. Once reports are falsified, the company loses its credibility, and that's worse than any financial loss." The rebuke landed hard, drawing sharp looks toward Victor. He pressed his lips together but continued wearing his proud facade, repeating that everything he had done was to protect the company's reputation. Outside, news of the exposed documents quickly topped the pages of Forbes, Business Insider, and countless other outlets. The articles no longer focused on Caleb the prodigy, but on a stark reality. Victor Hale had abused his power, concealed, and manipulated numbers to protect his seat of authority. Online comments surged with outrage. "This is the one who needs to be investigated. He tried to blame a kid to save himself." The wave of criticism swelled, turning Victor into a symbol of disgust, the perfect villain in the public's eye. Evelyn listened in silence. She recalled the venom in Victor's gaze toward Caleb just days earlier, and now saw clearly that everything he did was about self-preservation. She squeezed her son's hand, realizing that Caleb's calm was the direct opposite of the chaos swallowing Victor. Caleb only said quietly, "I knew from the start, lies don't last." In his eyes, there was no gloating, only the quiet certainty that truth always finds its way. Richard Cole monitored the situation from his office. His expression darkened. He felt no joy in seeing the company swept into a media storm, but he knew this was a chance to cut out the cancer that had grown unchecked. He recalled the image of Victor shouting, "I did it for the company," and saw only the desperate cry of a man buried in his own lies. The truth was out, and no mask left was thick enough to cover it. In the days that followed, as the company prepared to enter an official investigation, Victor Hale went from a man of power to someone teetering on the edge. The truth no longer stood with him, and once the wall shielding him collapsed, all that remained was the scornful gaze of the public. Those who once believed he was the protector of the company now collectively saw him as the reason it nearly crumbled. Richard Cole sat in silence for a moment, hands interlocked on the table, eyes fixed on Victor. The tension in the boardroom was so thick that every breath was audible. As soon as Victor finished saying, "I did it for the company," Richard slowly rose to his feet, his voice dropping low, each word cutting like ice. "You did it for your ego." The statement landed with finality, slicing through every excuse like a blade, plunging the room into absolute silence. No more whispers, no more shuffling papers. Every eye turned to Victor, waiting to see his reaction now that the facade had been stripped away. Victor trembled, his mouth agape but speechless. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but everyone looked down, avoiding his gaze. Those who had once echoed his sentiments in past meetings now offered only silence, Richard's words too brutal to challenge. With no shield left, Victor sat exposed before the crowd, collapsing into his chair, his frame sagging under the weight of the truth. His face went blank, pale, his lifeless eyes fixed on the table, as if the entire world had just turned its back on him. At that moment, Evelyn stood in the hallway just outside, hearing the distant echoes from the meeting room, her chest suddenly light. She didn't feel triumph, only a quiet sense of justice beginning to take form. After years of being looked down upon by Victor, she understood that he had finally walked himself to the edge. Caleb sat beside her, his eyes calm and bright, saying nothing, simply gazing through the glass window as if trying to commit to memory the image of a once powerful man now bowed like a defeated figure. Inside, Richard remained standing, his posture firm, his cold eyes still locked on Victor. He didn't need to utter another accusation. His single line, "You did it for your ego," had already turned every previous justification into a farce. The board members exchanged glances, a few nodding subtly, the agreement spreading silently across the room, as if to acknowledge that Victor had become a burden. The altered figures in the report said enough, and that truth could no longer be denied. Victor remained motionless, his trembling hand gripping the edge of the table, but he had no strength left to fight. He once believed he was the unshakable wall of the company, the one who decided the fate of others. But now, all that remained was a man stripped of every layer of pretense. In the eyes of those around him, he was no longer a powerful executive, only a selfish man laid bare by the truth. That moment marked a turning point, not just for the company but for the entire story of Caleb and Evelyn. A soft sigh rose from a corner of the room. Someone whispered, "He's finished." No one clapped. No one cheered, because Victor's downfall required no applause. It carried its own weight, heavy enough to make people bow their heads in silence. And in that stillness, Richard's eyes held a flash of resolve. The company would have to turn a new page, one with no room left for those who masked the truth behind personal gain. Victor Hale, the man who once sat high and shouted into others' faces, now slumped in his chair, his face vacant, like someone who had lost everything. And just beyond the door, Caleb gripped his mother's hand tightly, understanding that their fight had moved one step further, as the one who had shamed them now paid the price with his own collapse. After Victor collapsed into his chair in a daze, the board of directors had no choice but to announce a full-scale investigation. The decision was made in a closed-door meeting, but news quickly leaked, spreading through the hallways and out to the media. An internal memo was sent to every employee, confirming that all financial reports from the past 3 quarters would be reviewed, and the responsibilities of those involved would be clarified. No one was surprised to see Victor's name at the top of the list, but what truly shook public opinion was the board's choice to include the video of Caleb at the whiteboard as part of the official evidence file. The image of the boy writing complex symbols, the room falling silent, and CEO Richard finally admitting, "This boy is right," was clipped into a segment and attached to the investigation file. It wasn't just proof that the data had been manipulated. It was a reminder that truth can come from the most unexpected places. When the company's legal team presented the initial file, many were stunned that a child had become a key witness in a high-level corporate investigation. The media quickly caught on and flooded headlines with titles like "Janitor's Kid Video Used as Evidence" and "Cleaner Kid Genius Not Only Saved the Company, but Helped Uncover Fraud." The story, already red-hot, became even more dramatic, as there had never been a precedent for a viral social media clip being used as formal evidence in a billion-dollar corporate audit. Evelyn heard the news from a fellow shift worker, stunned to learn her son's image would be included in an official file. She feared Caleb would be scrutinized, but when she looked at him studying quietly in a corner, eyes focused, she realized he had been mentally prepared for this all along. Caleb wasn't surprised. He simply said, "The numbers will defend themselves." To him, the video wasn't a burden, but a mirror reflecting a truth that had already proven itself on the spot. Inside the company, employees whispered that the investigation wouldn't stop at Victor, but would also pull in others who had been complicit. Those who had covered up mistakes or stayed silent to protect their positions were now uneasy, as the video made it clear the error hadn't come from outside but from within the system. The work atmosphere grew tense. Every step down the hallway felt heavier, and everyone was afraid their name might be called in the review. Richard Cole, though maintaining a calm appearance, understood the pressure resting squarely on his shoulders. He had to protect the company's reputation while ensuring the truth was brought fully to light. When he signed the order to admit Caleb's video into the file, it felt like marking the start of a new era, an era where transparency must replace all forms of cover-up. It was also his signal to the entire corporation that no one could ever again use "protecting the company" as an excuse to distort the numbers. The official investigation began, and from that moment on, Caleb's story was no longer just a trending topic on social media or an inspiring quote in an auditorium. It had become part of the company's history, written into official documents, archived alongside the evidence, and destined one day to stand as proof that truth can come from anyone, even a boy who followed his mother to clean floors. In the first days of the investigation, the board decided to summon Evelyn Brooks for questioning. She was invited into the large conference room, where the fluorescent lights overhead cast a stern glow across the space. Evelyn sat on the right side, facing a long table of lawyers and board members, with a few secretaries behind her, scribbling nonstop. Her heart beat quickly, not out of fear for herself, but because she knew all eyes outside were fixed on her son. Questions came fast. Did you know about Caleb's abilities in advance? Did anyone coach him to write that formula? Do you or your son have any connections to people outside the company? Evelyn answered briefly, without evasion, that Caleb spotted the error on his own, that she never understood those numbers, and that all she ever did was push her cleaning cart and watch her son hold a pen. The simplicity of her words, free from embellishment, brought a moment of silence over the room. Caleb was called in immediately after. He sat on the tall chair, feet not reaching the floor, his bright eyes fixed straight ahead. A lawyer asked, "Why did you write those formulas? Did someone suggest or explain them to you beforehand?" Caleb didn't pause to think. He spoke just one sentence, clear and firm: "Numbers don't lie." The room fell still, and a few people glanced at one another, perhaps expecting him to continue, but Caleb stayed silent, letting his words echo on their own. The board members, used to hearing hours of arguments and justifications, suddenly felt that the simple truth hit them directly. Without lengthy citations, Caleb had offered a principle so basic it couldn't be challenged. An older lawyer slowly nodded, writing in the record that the response alone showed the boy's motives didn't come from any scheme, but from a genuine relationship with the truth. Others exhaled quietly. One or two pressed their lips together, recognizing that Caleb wasn't trying to defend himself. He was simply letting the numbers speak. Evelyn sat in the back row, her heart frozen in the moment her son spoke. After years of enduring scorn from others, she had never imagined the child she raised would one day stand as a witness to uphold the truth before a board of power. She saw Caleb's small but steady shoulders, his eyes unshaken, and in that moment, she realized her son no longer needed her protection. It was he who was now leading her out of the shadow of disdain. Outside, the media immediately picked up on this detail. Headlines across major outlets read, "The Genius Boy, Numbers Don't Lie," and "Stunning Testimony in the Billion-Dollar Investigation." Social media platforms spread Caleb's quote rapidly, turning it into a slogan printed on images, memes, and even used in speeches beyond the company's scope. Public reaction flared up again, with many calling this the most important message at a time when society was weary of fraud and cover-ups. Inside the boardroom, members ended the testimony session with contemplative expressions. No one dared to draw conclusions yet, but it was clear that the presence of Caleb and Evelyn had shifted the atmosphere. With just a few simple words, they had drawn a stark contrast to Victor's evasions and justifications. On one side was the excuse, "I did it for the company." On the other, a firm truth, "Numbers don't lie." And as the hearing ended, everyone in the room understood that the scales of justice were tipping decisively toward the truth. After the investigation hearing ended with shocking testimonies, an unexpected piece of news arrived for Evelyn's small family. Among the envelopes sent to the company and the congratulatory messages online, there was one special letter embossed with the seal of one of the most prestigious universities in the country. When Caleb opened it, formal words appeared. "We are honored to invite you to join our program for exceptional talents in mathematics and applied finance." This invitation was not just an academic opportunity, but a rare recognition, a clear affirmation that the boy's intellect could not be limited by age or circumstance. Caleb stayed silent for a long moment, his eyes shining, his hand trembling as he touched the bold text, overwhelmed by a feeling both unfamiliar and sacred. When Evelyn saw the letter, she froze. She held the paper, reading each word as if she couldn't believe it. For years, she had only hoped to give her son a safe life, attending the local school, growing up normally like other kids. The invitation from such a renowned institution did more than open a new door. It thrust them into the center of a different journey, one filled with both opportunities and challenges. She whispered, her voice tinged with trembling, "We just wanted a normal life." In those words was a deep anxiety, because she understood that the recent, unintentional fame had turned Caleb into a name recognized by millions, and the next step would not be easy. Caleb sat beside her, looking at his mother with sympathy. He knew she had endured many hard years, and that what she longed for most was peace, but he also understood that the path of intellect did not allow for retreat. "Mom," Caleb said softly, "I didn't choose to be famous, but if I can use my mind to open a different life, I want to try." Evelyn sat still, tears welling in her eyes, her hand resting on her son's shoulder, caught between fear and swelling pride. The letter quickly became breaking news once the media caught wind of the story behind it. Headlines reported that a boy once looked down on, who used to follow his mother cleaning floors, was now receiving an invitation from the dream university of millions. That powerful contrast shocked the public again, sparking intense discussion. Some praised it as a well-deserved reward. Others worried that Caleb was too young to face such a high-pressure environment. The comments flooded in, "This boy will go farther than we imagined. Hope he keeps that same calm as on day one." In the small apartment where Evelyn and her son lived, the air seemed weighed down by yet another heavy layer. Every word spoken, every look cast, now pointed toward them, when all they wanted was to return to quiet mornings. But amid the noise, the letter lay neatly on the table, shining with the light of a new path. Evelyn sat silently, occasionally glancing at it, torn between the dream of giving her son a chance to grow and the fear of losing the fragile normalcy they had clung to. Richard Cole, upon hearing the news, simply smiled quietly. He knew that this event was the clearest proof that truth always brings about deserved outcomes. He did not speak to the press, but in a brief meeting, he reminded the board, "Remember, a child once overlooked pointed out what we all failed to see. That boy's future is a wake-up call for all of us." His words made many bow their heads, for they understood that arrogance had led to crisis, while simple intellect had opened the door to redemption. That night, Evelyn held Caleb tightly, her voice trembling. "I'm afraid we may never live peacefully again." Caleb replied, gently but firmly, "Mom, I don't need a peaceful life. I just need a truthful one." And in the dark, those words echoed like a promise, signaling a new turning point for both mother and son, one that could no longer be reversed. Caleb sat across from his mother in their small room, the invitation letter from the prestigious university still on the table. He looked at Evelyn with bright eyes and said with certainty, "Mom, I want to study so I can help more people." The words left Evelyn momentarily stunned, her hands trembling as she laid them on the paper, filled with both worry and rising pride. She understood clearly that her son was not chasing fame, but truly desired to use his mind to do something meaningful. Caleb did not just want to prove his worth, he wanted to open a path for those who had been dismissed, just like them. In that moment, Evelyn could feel how much her son had grown. She remembered the days Caleb followed her around, tiny hands, holding a mop, curious eyes, watching the computer screens in the company lobby. Now, those eyes held more than curiosity, they held determination and ideals. Evelyn smiled faintly, a smile mixed with tears, and whispered, "If that's what you truly want, I'll be by your side. She couldn't erase her fears, but the conviction in her son's voice left no room for denial. News of Caleb receiving the special scholarship quickly reached Richard Cole. He wasn't surprised, for from the moment he saw the boy write those formulas on the whiteboard, he knew this was no ordinary talent. When reporters asked for his opinion, Richard simply nodded, his voice deep and steady. This boy deserves it. That short affirmation was immediately published on the front page of many newspapers, spreading almost as widely as Caleb's earlier quote, "Numbers don't lie." Within the company, many employees read the news and felt ashamed. They remembered the morning Caleb was handed a rag, the mocking laughter, and now had to witness that same boy being recognized by the CEO himself. Some sent private apologies to Evelyn, others quietly placed small flowers on the cleaning cart she still used every day. That quiet shift showed that Richard's statement, "deserves it," had begun to create another effect. No one dared look down on them anymore. Caleb received everything with calm composure. He didn't show pride, didn't boast, and only focused on rereading the letter and thinking about what he could learn. In his heart, knowledge was the only path to protect the truth, to help those who didn't have the opportunities he did. Evelyn watched her son closely, realizing that the boy she once knew had crossed into a new threshold, where intelligence didn't just save a company, but could change many other lives. Outside, public opinion buzzed non-stop. Some praised, others doubted, but all had to admit one thing. Caleb Brooks had become a symbol of rising above prejudice. And when Richard Cole, the man at the top of power, uttered the word, "deserves it," it was no longer just recognition for a boy, but a message to society as a whole. Talent has no class, and intelligence isn't limited by skin color or background. Evelyn ended a long day with a lighter heart. She knew her son had chosen his own path, one filled with challenges but also hope. In the quiet darkness, Caleb's words still echoed in her mind. "Mom, I want to study so I can help more people." And Richard's affirmation felt like a confirming beat. "This boy deserves it." Those two sentences blended together, opening a future Evelyn had never dared to dream of, but that now had become undeniable truth. As public pressure mounted, the board of directors was forced to make unprecedented decisions. A formal announcement was released, declaring that the company would overhaul its entire auditing department. The old leadership was replaced, and an independent team of experts was brought in to re-examine every process and financial oversight system. Reports once considered untouchable were now being reviewed, line by line, number by number. No one dared ignore the errors once pointed out by a boy, because now, any ambiguity could be exposed to the public. The atmosphere in the company shifted dramatically. With every employee feeling the weight of transparency being enforced, there was no longer room for the old habits of survival through concealment. During these days of reform, Evelyn quietly continued her daily work. She pushed her cleaning cart down the same halls, her hands familiar with every patch of dust along the corners. But the way people looked at her had changed. Employees who once regarded her with indifference, even disdain, now nodded in acknowledgement, some pausing to let her pass with newfound respect. The once cold atmosphere had shifted in subtle but profound ways. Evelyn was surprised, sometimes slowing her steps, unsure whether those smiles were real, but the looks in their eyes no longer carried mockery. They had begun to see her as part of the company, not just a silent shadow meant to wipe away the dirt. A young employee from the accounting department, who had witnessed the chaotic morning, approached Evelyn as she paused by the elevator. He hesitated briefly, then said, "Thank you for raising such a brave kid." Evelyn was taken aback, her heart stirred, and she could only manage a gentle smile in reply. It was the first time in years of work that she had heard a word of acknowledgement from a colleague, not an order, not a sneer. In that moment, she realized her presence had changed in their eyes, no longer tied to a mop or rag, but to the image of a mother who had helped uphold the truth. Caleb watched everything unfold with steady eyes. He knew he had opened a door not just for the company, but for his mother as well. In the fresh looks people gave Evelyn, he saw glimpses of fairness being restored. The laughter from before had been replaced with respect, and that made Caleb feel his efforts were not in vain. Across departments, the shift was even more noticeable. Employees no longer signed off on reports without checking them thoroughly, knowing now that the truth could be exposed at any moment. Meetings were no longer about hiding losses, but about finding practical ways to fix them. Though the pressure was heavier, many admitted that for the first time in years, their work felt genuinely meaningful. They were no longer forced to turn a blind eye, and it was Caleb who had triggered that change. Evelyn understood that her position in the company hadn't changed just because of a few kind words. She was still a janitor, still had to complete her daily tasks. But as she walked down the polished hallways, she felt lighter, no longer burdened by the sense of being pushed aside. The respectful glances from coworkers felt like an invisible gift, a quiet compensation for the many years of cold indifference. and deep inside, she silently thanked her son, because it was he who had given her not just pride, but a simple sense of justice she once believed she would never reach. One quiet evening, after days of company-wide reform, Caleb sat in the small room where Evelyn usually rested after her shift. The room, once furnished with only an old wooden table and a whiteboard she used to write cleaning reminders, had now become a place where he wanted to leave something important. He picked up a marker and wrote slowly, carefully, "No one gets to look down on Mom." The strokes were firm and aligned, as if he were carving a declaration into the air, a promise he had carried for a long time. When he finished the last word, Caleb stepped back, eyes fixed on the sentence, his face calm, but his eyes glowing with fierce determination. Evelyn walked in moments later, surprised to see her son standing before the board. She looked at the bold letters, her hands tightening slightly at the hem of her shirt. In an instant, old memories flooded back, those mornings when she was shooed away from the lobby, the mocking laughter when people saw her son following behind, and the moment Caleb stood tall before a crowd. She gently reached out to touch the fresh ink, feeling her chest swell with emotion. It wasn't just writing, it was protection, a vow from a boy who had walked beside her through the darkest of days. But Evelyn, humble by nature, didn't want those words to remain like a slogan on display. She took a cloth and quietly wiped the letters away, her hand trembling as the ink began to fade. To her, erasing didn't mean denying, but holding it closer, deep within her heart, where nothing could erase it. When the last word disappeared, she sat down in silence, eyes glistening with tears, but a soft smile forming on her lips. She knew that promise would always live inside Caleb, and it would be the strength that carried her forward, no matter how many challenges still awaited. Caleb looked at his mother, understanding that she didn't want people to think they were asking for pity or attention. But he also knew that in wiping away the sentence, she had quietly acknowledged it was truer than anything else. He walked over and sat beside her, his small hand resting on her calloused one. "I don't need them to remember the words," Caleb said softly, his voice calm and steady. "I just need them to remember how you lived." Evelyn turned to look at her son, eyes full of tears, and said nothing, just nodded gently. The small room returned to its usual simplicity, but for both mother and son, what had just happened felt like a turning point. For Caleb, writing the sentence was a way to declare that the humiliation of the past would never happen again. For Evelyn, erasing it was a way to remind herself to stay calm and humble, but the emotion in her eyes showed that the words had become a quiet fire burning in her heart. Outside, the company continued to transform, the new auditing system operating with strict oversight. But inside this small room, the change was more personal and profound than any official reform. It wasn't on paper, not recorded in any minutes, but lived in the bond between a mother and son who had endured every level of contempt. Evelyn knew that even though the words had been erased, they would still rise in her heart whenever she recalled the fierce look in her son's eyes. And Caleb knew that protecting his mother didn't require noise, because with just one silent promise, he had already laid the foundation for a future where there was no room left for disdain. As the company's reforms began to take real shape, the press started to look beyond internal affairs. Many major outlets asserted that the story of Caleb Brooks was not just a financial incident but a turning point in social justice. Commentators analyzed how the fact that a janitor's son exposed hundreds of millions in errors revealed the stark divide between real intelligence and class prejudice. Editorials emphasized, "This is a reminder that justice can begin with the most ordinary people." The image of Caleb standing at the whiteboard, and his words, "Numbers don't lie," were repeated as a symbol of the transparency society craves. The story's reach didn't stop at newsrooms. On social media, countless community groups and forums began using it to discuss the injustice often faced by the working class. Posts filled with hope began to circulate. If a boy can speak the truth to the powerful, then we can also stand for what's right in everyday life. The public saw this as a clear example that truth doesn't need a glamorous stage. It only needs to be voiced at the right moment to move people's hearts. In working-class neighborhoods, news about Caleb became a hot topic. Factory workers, night shift guards, and office cleaners felt empowered. Many said to each other, "If they dare look down on us, remember Caleb. Remember that no one has the right to bury the truth." They no longer saw the story as something distant, but as a reminder that everyone holds value. Mothers working tirelessly to raise their children saw themselves in Evelyn, and their sons' eyes lit up when they heard about the boy who stood up against mockery. Many schools brought the story into classrooms, with teachers sharing it to encourage students that intelligence knows no wealth. Some even used the video as a lesson in courage and conviction. In students' essays, many wrote that they wanted to be like Caleb, unafraid of being underestimated. From one small act, the story became a source of educational inspiration, spreading far and wide. Evelyn felt that shift every day. On her way to work, strangers would stop to greet her, offer words of encouragement. She wasn't used to the attention, but her heart warmed, knowing her son had sparked hope in others. Caleb, still calm and focused on his studies, smiled when his mother told him about the working families finding strength in his story. That, he said, is the greatest reward. Justice was no longer just a word in the headlines. It became a tangible feeling within the community. Caleb's story didn't erase all injustice, but it sparked a new belief. That truth, once protected, holds power far beyond any walls of class. And from poor neighborhoods to high-rise buildings, people began to whisper the same message. Intellect and dignity can exist anywhere, as long as someone dares to stand up and prove it. From news articles and television programs, the story quickly turned into a social media campaign. The hashtag number #GeniusFromJanitor first appeared in a post by a student group, then spread at a pace no one could control. Within a week, millions of shares pushed the phrase into a global trend. Photos of Caleb at the whiteboard were posted with the hashtag, accompanied by comments that were brief but powerful. Genius doesn't care about background. This proves intelligence knows no class. Across platforms, people created illustrated art, printed t-shirts, and even made posters with number #GeniusFromJanitor as a reminder that truth can rise from the humblest places. In that wave, countless personal stories were shared alongside the hashtag. A factory worker wrote, "I used to be laughed at for doing manual labor, but now I'm proud of the job I hold." A rural schoolteacher posted a photo of her classroom with the caption, "I teach my students that Caleb proved no one should ever be underestimated." These messages made the hashtag more than just an online phenomenon. It became a movement spreading across communities. People found in it a deep sense of solidarity, as if Caleb's story was their own. Caleb sat in the small room, his old phone connected to the internet, the screen glowing in the night. He quietly scrolled through the comments, reading the praise, the encouragement, and the honest stories of humiliation that many had endured. One line read, "Thank you for being brave. You didn't just save a company, you saved our belief." Another said, "I hope my son grows up with the kind of resolve you have." Every word felt like a heartbeat echoing in the boy's chest. Caleb smiled, not the smile of someone victorious, but a calm smile, knowing his effort had truly reached people. Evelyn stepped in and saw her son focused on the screen. She worried the flood of attention might consume him, but when she saw that smile, she understood Caleb wasn't reading for applause, but to feel the trust spreading. She sat down beside him, gently tilting her head to look at the tiny lines of text. A rare quiet moment appeared, where mother and son shared a silent pride, needing no further words. Outside, the hashtag continued to be mentioned at social events, even appearing on banners promoting fairness and opportunity. Activists called it the spark that reignited faith in everyday intelligence. Many international forums began analyzing it, seeing Caleb as a new symbol of a generation, willing to stand up against prejudice. This widespread recognition completely drowned out the mocking laughter from before, replacing it with respect and empathy. Caleb closed his phone and sat quietly in the dark, but the smile remained on his lips. In his heart, the joy didn't come from the spotlight of fame, but from knowing that so many people had found strength in his story. That was the greatest reward, one that couldn't be bought with money or prestige, but only came from a simple truth being acknowledged. Late one afternoon, as the last light of day streamed through the large glass windows, Richard Cole personally invited Evelyn and Caleb to his private office. The atmosphere in the room was unlike before, no longer filled with the tension of board meetings or the cold detachment of a man in power. Instead, Richard pulled out chairs for the mother and son, his eyes reflecting sincerity. He began in a steady, deep voice, "From now on, this company will no longer discriminate." The words landed like a commitment, not an empty promise to calm public opinion, but a declaration carrying weight from the very person leading a complete overhaul of the system. Evelyn looked up slightly, her eyes widening in surprise. She was used to hollow words from past superiors, people who had promised fairness but never followed through. This time, though, Richard's tone felt different, forged in the fire of crisis. She sat still, emotion rising in her chest, and asked quietly, "Do you truly believe that's possible?" Richard nodded, his eyes meeting hers without flinching. He replied, "We've seen what happens when arrogance and prejudice silence the truth. I won't let that happen again." Caleb sat beside her, silently observing, his hands resting neatly on his lap. He wasn't used to political promises, but the steadiness in Richard's gaze convinced him this wasn't a performance. Caleb spoke softly, his voice calm but resonant. "If the truth is always heard, this company will be much stronger." Richard looked at him, smiled faintly, then replied, "Exactly, and you are the proof of that." The brief exchange held mutual respect, no longer a gap between a boy and a CEO, but a conversation between two people who believed in real values. In that moment, Evelyn felt freed from years of lowered eyes and silent endurance. She didn't seek fame or privilege, but hearing the words, "no longer discriminate," lifted a weight from her shoulders. She smiled, tears gathering in her eyes, and said softly, "As long as the company sees all employees as equals, I believe no one will have to go through what my son and I did." Richard listened, then tilted his head in a quiet gesture of agreement. That moment in the room wasn't loud, wasn't recorded by cameras, but its impact outweighed any press conference. It was a mutual acknowledgement. Richard admitted the truth had been overlooked for too long. Evelyn acknowledged that trust could still take root, and Caleb acknowledged that the path he stepped onto was no longer just for himself, but for others as well. As they stood up, the last rays of sunset cast their shadows across the tiled floor. It was no longer the silhouette of a superior and a janitor, nor of a genius child facing the world of finance, but of three people bound by a single promise. Justice would be upheld, and truth would always have its place. Evelyn held her son's hand, Caleb gave a soft smile, and Richard clenched his fist as if to remind himself to fulfill the commitment he had just made. And so, in that quiet space, a promise was etched deep, signaling the beginning of a new era where prejudice would no longer be a dividing wall. Evelyn sat quietly in the room where the conversation had just ended, her hands clasped, tears falling down her cheeks. She looked at Richard, then turned to her son, her voice trembling but sincere. "All we ask for is respect." It was a simple statement, not a demand for anything grand, but a deep yearning born from years of enduring disdainful stares. In those tears were the memories of silent mornings spent mopping floors under mocking laughter, the fear that her son would be buried under discrimination, and the quiet relief of finally being heard. Caleb sat beside her, his small hand resting on her shoulder, his gaze steady and far beyond his years. He didn't say much, only nodded, his voice clear. "I promise I won't let you bow your head." That promise echoed in the still room, stronger than any official declaration, because it came from the heart of a son who had witnessed his mother's every hardship. Caleb didn't speak of grand plans or paint a dazzling future. He simply made one promise, personal, grounded, and yet the most vital of all, to protect his mother's dignity. Richard Cole remained silent, his eyes briefly reflecting emotion. He had seen billion-dollar contracts and heard countless promises in negotiations, but never had a single sentence carried such weight. He understood that this promise would drive Caleb forward, at the same time, serve as a wake-up call for himself and the company. In that moment, Richard no longer saw himself as a CEO, but as a witness to the sacred bond between a mother and her son. Evelyn wiped her tears, but the tremble in her heart remained. She looked at her son, and saw in his eyes a future she had never dared dream of. That promise wasn't just for her, it was also for Caleb himself, a thread to tie him back to where he came from. Evelyn smiled through her tears, knowing that from now on, every step her son took would carry the image of a mother who once bent down in silence to clean those very floors. And she would no longer have to lower her head in silence again. Caleb gently squeezed his mother's hand, then lifted his eyes and looked straight ahead. He knew the road wouldn't be easy, with new challenges waiting, but in his heart, the promise he had just made was the guiding light. He had seen the power of truth, felt the force of justice, and now understood that it all began with one simple truth. No one has the right to trample on his mother's dignity. That moment ended in a silence full of meaning. No more justifications, no more debate, only a commitment etched deeply into the hearts of all three. Richard tilted his head slightly, as if to acknowledge that the company would truly have to change. Evelyn wiped away her tears, her heart lighter now that she could finally hold her head high. And Caleb, with a calm smile, knew that his promise would stay with him, like a compass guiding every step he would take from here on. In the fading light of day, the image of the three of them merged into one, forming a complete portrait of truth, justice, and love. The first day Caleb set foot in the university lecture hall, the atmosphere felt both unfamiliar and full of promise. As the classroom door opened, hundreds of eyes immediately turned toward him, not just because of how much younger he looked than most students, but also because his reputation had preceded him. Whispers spread throughout the room, a few voices murmuring, "That's the kid who saved $100 million. Those murmurs carried no trace of the contempt he once faced at the company, but rather curiosity mixed with respect. Some students discreetly pulled out their phones to capture the moment, eager to share that they were sitting in the same class as someone the world was talking about. Caleb walked to his seat, calm in demeanor, but focused in his gaze. He heard all the whispers, but didn't react, quietly taking his seat and placing his notebook on the desk. Deep down, he knew this was a completely new beginning, unlike standing on the company stage or facing the investigation board. Here, he was no longer the center of scorn or explosive admiration, but just another student who had to prove himself through knowledge and persistence. The formulas on the board were no longer proof of a shocking event, but daily challenges to sharpen his intellect. The professor entered the room, his eyes briefly pausing on Caleb before beginning the lecture. There was no special treatment, only lengthy equations and complex models that every student had to keep up with. Caleb took notes diligently, each line steady, occasionally looking up at the board with a clear, attentive gaze. Those sitting nearby initially glanced at him often, but soon became absorbed in the lesson, realizing that the boy who saved 100 million was just as serious and focused as they were. Evelyn, in a small corner of the student dorm, was folding Caleb's blankets. She knew he wanted independence, but couldn't hide the worry as he started this new chapter. When she heard other students whispering about Caleb, she simply smiled quietly. In her heart, she understood that curious stares would follow her son for a long time, but she also believed he was steady enough to handle it. What she hoped for most was not that Caleb would become a legend, but that he would find joy in learning and live in an environment that genuinely respected intellect. Back in the classroom, when the professor presented a difficult problem, the room fell silent. Many eyes turned again to Caleb, almost automatically assuming he would solve it. He looked up at the board, a familiar spark in his eyes, then calmly wrote a few lines in his notebook. No one saw him rush, and there was no showmanship, but in that quiet focus, many sensed clearly that his intelligence was not some random story, it was part of who he was. That silence lingered, then faded as the professor continued. But no one could deny they were studying alongside someone who had made the entire financial world rethink its assumptions. Caleb sat still, a faint smile on his face, as the murmurs behind him gradually faded. He knew there would be more whispers, more eyes watching, but he also knew this was just the beginning. Ahead of him were long days of studying, challenges that wouldn't be easy, and he was ready to face them. That smile wasn't because of fame, but because of the belief that he was on the right path, the one he had chosen and promised to follow, so his mother would never have to bow her head again. Caleb sat in the new lecture hall, a thick textbook issued to students lying out before him. He opened it, his fingers gliding over each page, as if trying to absorb the scent of new paper and the challenge of the printed words. A quiet smile appeared on his face, not of pride, but of excitement as he faced the knowledge he had longed to explore. He had imagined this day for so long, the day he would no longer just stand at the whiteboard in a company or appear in a viral video, but officially enter the academic world, sitting as an equal among others who shared his passion for learning. He knew eyes were still on him, but now, all that attention no longer made him feel out of place. It felt like motivation to prove that his intellect would continue to grow. Outside the school gate, Evelyn stood silently, looking through the curve of the iron fence at the figure of her son leaning over his desk. Her eyes were full of indescribable pride, mixed with emotion and gratitude. She remembered when Caleb was little, how his eyes lit up at the numbers on receipts she brought home, the nights he scribbled equations she couldn't understand. Today, her son sat in a prestigious university lecture hall, among new classmates, recognized not out of pity but because of his true ability. Evelyn gently wiped her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but because she knew her sacrifices had finally borne fruit. The other students in class hadn't stopped whispering about the boy who had become a symbol of justice, but gradually, they noticed Caleb was focused solely on his books, unbothered by the chatter. That calmness shifted the atmosphere from curiosity to respect. A nearby student leaned over, hesitantly asked, "Can you help explain this formula?" Caleb looked up, a kind smile forming, and he patiently pointed out each step, explaining clearly in simple terms. There was no showing off, only a desire to share knowledge. The curious glances turned into looks of admiration, and the classroom gradually quieted down, ready to listen to a boy once called the janitor's kid. Evelyn stood outside, the evening breeze brushing against her shirt. She knew her son would face new challenges, the pressure of fame, the enormous expectations placed on his small shoulders. But in this moment, watching Caleb bent over his notes, she felt at ease. He wasn't swallowed by the spotlight, but chose to stand firm on the foundation of true knowledge. Evelyn saw herself in her son, the perseverance and humility, but also a fire she had never possessed, the fire to challenge those in power in order to keep the truth clear and unshaken. Caleb kept flipping through the pages, feeling the weight of knowledge, but also finding joy in every line. To him, this wasn't the beginning of a distant journey, but the next step in the promise he once made to his mother. "I won't let you bow your head," he repeated silently, and every lecture, every formula, became part of that promise. The sound of his pen gliding across the paper, the neat alignment of numbers, all created a rhythm he believed would lead him to something greater. Outside the gate, Evelyn didn't take her eyes off her son. She remembered the days she scrubbed floors under mocking laughter, the days Caleb sat in the hallway corner waiting for her to finish her shift. All that hardship had now become the foundation for her son's path forward. She didn't hope for him to become the greatest, only that Caleb would keep his calm and compassion. But as she watched him in the lecture hall, eyes lit up at the pages before him, Evelyn quietly realized her son was going further than she had ever dared to dream. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and students began to leave, but Caleb remained a moment longer, carefully closing his books. He didn't want to rush, he wanted to savor the feeling of being part of this place. As he stepped out the classroom door, a few classmates nodded and smiled at him, and he returned the gesture with a quiet smile. These small moments, for Caleb, meant more than any round of applause from the public, because they were genuine recognition, untouched by outside noise. Evelyn saw her son from afar, backpack on his shoulders, walking slowly beneath the afternoon sunday. She moved closer, said nothing, and simply placed her hand on his shoulder. Caleb looked up, his eyes filled with quiet joy. In that moment, they both understood they had made it through the darkest days to arrive here. And from that lecture hall, a new beginning truly unfolded, not just for Caleb, but for Evelyn too, who had spent her life protecting and raising her son with all the quiet love she had. The two of them stepped out through the school gate as dusk fell, the last rays of sunlight touching their shoulders. No longer could contempt weigh them down. No gaze could make them lower their heads. All that remained was a steady belief in their hearts. A new journey had begun, and this time, it was one of knowledge and justice, where the promise between mother and son would continue to be written with every steady step forward. In a small room at the company, the whiteboard that once witnessed the moment Caleb wrote out the string of formulas still stood. Though it had been wiped clean many times, faint traces of old ink seemed to linger, evoking the image of a calm boy standing before hundreds of skeptical eyes to reveal the truth. That board became a symbol, not because it held complex equations, but because it captured the moment true intellect shattered prejudice. Every time a new employee stepped into the meeting room, they heard the story of that day, a story that began with mocking laughter and ended in stunned silence. The whiteboard had outgrown its role as a teaching tool, to become a witness to an irreversible transformation. Down the company hallways, people still occasionally recalled the story, sometimes with admiration, sometimes as a cautionary tale. Caleb's simple words were passed from one to another, most often echoed as, "Genius doesn't choose class." That sentence made its way across desks and into meetings, reminding everyone that ability can emerge from anywhere, even from those society is used to looking down on. Over time, it became more than just a story from a financial firm. It turned into a widely cited example in discussions on social equity, appearing in books, and woven into lectures for students. Evelyn often returned to the room with the whiteboard. She didn't say much, only stood silently, as if searching for the image of her son on that day. To her, the moment Caleb picked up the marker wasn't just about solving a math problem, it was when her son stood up for their shared dignity. The whiteboard became a quiet place where she could place her pride, a testament that her child had surpassed the limits society once tried to place on him. Each time she left the room, she felt lighter, knowing that no matter how much those ink marks faded with time, the memory would remain untouched. At his new university, Caleb still heard those words echo around him. Classmates called him the boy who saved $100 million, but when they quoted, "Genius doesn't choose class," Caleb only smiled. He knew those words weren't just for him, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated. In class, he remained humble, diligent, never letting fame cloud his true goal. Deep down, he understood he carried a heavy responsibility, because every step he took was watched by many as proof that fairness could, in fact, be real. Richard Cole also referred to that story more than once during key meetings. When speaking with shareholders, he openly admitted that the company's arrogance had nearly cost them everything, and that it was only thanks to a boy on the sidelines that the truth came to light. He used the very words, "Genius doesn't choose class," to close his speech, leaving the room in silence before it erupted in applause. Richard understood that the story had not only changed the corporation's outlook but had also become a moral compass for every decision that followed. In society, working-class families found encouragement in the story. Many told their children that if Caleb could do something extraordinary, they, too, could nurture their dreams without fear of being looked down upon. The hashtag number genius, from janitor, still appeared online, no longer as viral as before, but as a constant reminder that a child from the lowest social class could change a corporation. Each time the story was reshared, it reignited the belief that justice could begin with the most ordinary steps. Evelyn lived quietly, continuing her janitorial work, but those around her looked at her differently. They no longer saw her as a low-level employee, but as a symbol of patience and quiet strength. She didn't need praise, only the simple respect shown in each glance. And when she overheard coworkers quietly say, "Genius doesn't choose class," the corners of her mouth lifted in a faint smile, because she knew it was not just recognition for Caleb, but for all people like her. The story came to a close, but its echo remained. The whiteboard still stood, carrying the memory of a seismic day. The phrase, "Genius doesn't choose class," continued to be repeated, not as a hollow slogan, but as a proven truth. Caleb continued his academic journey, Evelyn continued her familiar work, and Richard continued reforming the company. But all of them were bound by a lasting lesson. Truth and intellect belong to no specific class. They belong to those brave enough to defend them. And in that lesson, everyone found a new belief that fairness isn't distant, but can begin with any pair of hands and any thinking mind. The story of Caleb and Evelyn didn't end with corrected figures, revised reports, or an internal investigation. It left behind a resounding lesson. Justice and talent can overturn an entire system when that system is built on arrogance and deceit. The image of a young boy from a working-class background, standing before the most powerful figures to assert the truth, became living proof that intelligence is not confined by social status. The story is retold not to praise a single equation, but to remind people that even the most rigid structures can collapse when challenged by truth. Media and social communities have often used the story as a vivid illustration of human potential for change. Scholars analyze that when a system is built on prejudice, it weakens from within. With just one bright mind and a strong will, the flaws become visible, leading to transformation. People began to talk more about fairness in organizations, about how to hear voices from the lowest ranks. And in every discussion, the image of a CEO bowing before a child still appeared as a powerful symbol of the humility required of those in power. The moment Richard Cole bowed his head to acknowledge Caleb was captured, circulated, and etched into collective memory. No longer the cold CEO, Richard in that instant became a real human being, capable of admitting mistakes, of placing truth above personal pride. That image now hangs in the company's boardroom as a reminder that leadership must be humble when faced with truth. For many, it holds more weight than any policy or procedural change, because it proves that humility is the foundation of true reform. Every time Evelyn sees that photo, her heart stirs. She never wished for anyone to kneel or cheer, only for respect to be returned. And now, as that image becomes a symbol, she understands that the dignity of her and her son has not only been protected, but has helped open a path for many others. Caleb, ever composed, doesn't view it as a personal victory. He sees it as proof of the promise he once made. "I won't let you bow your head." In the image of the CEO bowing, he sees confirmation that his mother will no longer have to live under looks of contempt. On academic forums and in classrooms, the story continues to be cited as a prime example of how justice and talent can go hand in hand. Young students revisit it, analyze it, and remind themselves that truth holds power far beyond any social status. Inspirational speeches often end with the photo of Richard bowing, accompanied by the message, "Humbling yourself before truth doesn't make you smaller, it makes you greater." That phrase has gradually become a life philosophy for many, not only in finance but in everyday life. The company changed, society changed, and even working-class families began to see themselves differently. In the story, they found hope that their children could rise, that voices from the margins could still echo in the halls of power. And when their eyes fall on that symbolic photo, they don't just see a CEO and a boy, they see the triumph of justice, the rise of talent, and the undeniable power of humility. The story closes on a scene far removed from that first morning when Evelyn pushed her cart into the building under scornful stares. From the mocking laughter thrown at mother and son, to the moment Caleb picked up the marker at the whiteboard, to the ripple that shook public opinion, and the investigations that rocked the company, the journey played out like a mirror reflecting the fragility of anything built on arrogance and deceit. It all began with a seemingly harmless remark, but once truth surfaced, the entire power structure had to bow, and in the moment, Richard Cole bowed to the boy. That image became the symbol of a deeper lesson. Humility before intellect and justice never weakens authority, it makes it stronger. Looking back at the entire story, the focus doesn't lie in the hundreds of millions of dollars, but in the confrontation between prejudice and truth. Caleb, a boy who simply accompanied his mother to her cleaning job, crossed the harsh boundaries of class to prove that intelligence does not choose where it is born. Evelyn, the mother who once bent over floors with a mop, became a symbol of patience and silent sacrifice, and it was that very love and resilience that raised a child brave enough to stand against power. Richard, a CEO used to giving orders, learned that arrogance had driven the company into crisis, and only the acknowledgement of truth could save it. Even Victor Hale, who once mocked and abused his authority, became a vivid reminder that deceit cannot last, and when exposed, it will crush the very person who created it. The strength of this story lies in the fact that it didn't end within the four walls of a company. From a whiteboard, it rippled into public discourse, became a hashtag, a slogan, a belief for millions of workers who had long lived in the shadow of prejudice. Factory families found hope, students found a role model, and leaders found a warning. And whenever someone repeats the phrase, "Genius doesn't choose class," it is not only to honor Caleb, but to remind us that anyone can speak up when the truth needs to be defended. The first lesson from this journey is the value of truth. Caleb proved that truth does not need flowery words or noise to exist. It only needs the right moment to come to light. When he said, "Numbers don't lie," It was more than a response during an investigation, it was a simple philosophy strong enough to collapse the false walls of power. In a world full of manipulation and cover-ups, that sentence became a beacon, showing that any lie, no matter how sophisticated, will eventually be exposed. The second lesson is the power of patience and love. Evelyn had no lofty education, but she had the quiet strength to endure years of disregard. That patience became an example for Caleb, teaching him that dignity doesn't come from what others say, but from how one chooses to act. She cried when she said, "We only ask for respect, because that is all an ordinary person ever truly wants." And Caleb's promise, "I won't let you bow your head," turned love into the strongest force, powerful enough to overcome any obstacle. The third lesson is the role of humility. The image of Richard bowing before Caleb was not the failure of a leader, but proof that humility before truth is real strength. In that moment, Richard showed the world that honor lies not in hiding mistakes, but in owning and correcting them. And from that very moment, the company changed, the system changed, becoming a place that listened more, that respected more. The final lesson is faith in the value of a human being. From a boy who once threw a rag, Caleb became a student at a prestigious university. From a mother once seen as lowly, Evelyn became a symbol of patience and love. From a giant corporation full of arrogance, the company became a model for reform. And from a story that seemed small, society found inspiration to re-examine how people treat one another. As long as that whiteboard still stands in the room, even with the faded ink, people still see the image of Caleb on that day. It serves as proof of a simple truth. Justice and talent can overturn an entire system when that system is built on injustice. And in people's memory, the moment the CEO bowed to the boy will remain a symbol of humility, a reminder that power only holds true value when it respects humanity. The story of Caleb and Evelyn is not a fleeting anecdote, but a journey that leaves a lasting imprint. It reminds us that anyone, no matter their background, can rewrite their fate through intelligence, determination, and loyalty to the truth. It affirms that respect is not a privilege, but a basic right of every person. And above all, it leaves a spiritual legacy. Live with truth, act with compassion, and remember that when intelligence and justice unite, they can change the world.